Наші Прийшли окупанти до нас в Україну, форма новенька, воєнні машини, та трохи поплавився їх інвентар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Російські танкісти сховались в кущі, щоб лаптем посьорбати довбані щі, та трохи у щах перегрівся навар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Приперли зі сходу до нас барани для восстановлення
великої страни.
Найкращий пастух баранячих отар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Їх доводи всяке озброєння різне, потужні ракети, машини залізні, у нас на всі доводи є коментар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Вони захопити хотіли нас зразу, а ми зачаїли на орків образу з російських бандитів, робить примар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Російська поліція справи заводить, там вбивцю рашистів ніяк не знаходить, хто винен, що в нашому полі глухар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Веде пропаганду кремлівський урод, слова пропаганди ковтає народ, тепер нове слово знає цар.
Байрактар.
Байрактар. Байрактар.
Байрактар.
Байрактар.
Yes.
The Leaf Spring Army sends its regards.
Русский военный корабль. Предлагаю сложить оружие и сдаться. Русский военный корабль, иди нахуй.
Наші
Hello, everyone. I'm the Enforcer, and I'm accompanied by Enforcer Matt.
And welcome back, folks. It's Enforcer Matt, and welcome back to day 526 on the news. And it's good to see you all once again. And of course, we have big news, and NATO is on high alert today.
And of course, we're going to be covering the breaking news of the past 24 hours of the war in Ukraine, and also what's been going on outside of Ukraine. But the massive breaking news that just came out while we were going live is that it has been confirmed that Russian forces have been pushed back in the area of Bakhmut all the way to the railroad line. They have been pushed out of Kuzemivka, Andreevka, and Klishkivka today. It has been completely confirmed, and this is the largest frontline advance we have seen in the Bakhmut battlefield since the very beginning of the Russian offensive almost a year ago at this time. It is huge news. And of course, we're going to be getting into that in just a second, but before we do, and making sure to give it just a little bit of time so that way we can go and check Twitter before we get to it here in a minute, we're going to be moving on into the other breaking news of the day, in that NATO forces are beginning to engage in standoffs with the Belarusians along the border, and the situation is getting far more serious than it has been in previous weeks or even months. Of course, many of y'all know that this all began, this previous level of escalation, after two Belarusian helicopters, an Mi-8 and an Mi-24, flew nearly 3.5 kilometers, or about 2.25 miles, into the territory of Poland and then turned around. Many people have been wondering, why is this that big of a deal? This can't be too big of a deal. The reason that it's a big deal is that these helicopters didn't veer off of course and kind of just drift on a flight path from north to south into Poland and then back out. They actually flew straight from Belarus into Poland, directly westwards, and then flew about 3.7 kilometers in, about to this area right here, and then turned around and flew directly back, almost a complete 180 from where they had been. And this shows that it wasn't just a navigational error, this had to have been something deliberate. Helicopters, and of course the Mi-8s, actually have a built-in compass onto the, I guess you could say the dashboard of the helicopter. That would be the best way to say it. And it shows exactly what direction the helicopter is facing in at any given moment. And the fact that these helicopter pilots saw that they were flying directly west and then flew all the way into Polish airspace and then back out clearly shows that this was some kind of a deliberate attempt by Belarusian aviators to challenge the sovereignty of Poland's borders. This has caused the Poles to start to build up forces in this area yesterday, increasing the amount of Polish soldiers in the area in an undefined number. And we've also heard a Polish general come out today and directly threaten the Belarusians and the Russians that any further border incursions will be met by being shot down immediately. According to the statement from the Polish general today, General Marek Sokolowski, the helicopters are armed and ready to fight. There are very experienced pilots here. There are pilots who have been used on board weapons and missile systems, or who have used on board weapons and missile systems with me in Afghanistan and Iraq. And this is clearly saying that the Polish aviators are no conscripts. They are very experienced, have been in the Polish army for quite a while, and they know how to use the weapons on board their aircraft, specifically their helicopters, to be able to engage and shoot down any further border incursions that occur from the Belarusian or Russian side. This is a very clear escalation of the standoff in between NATO forces, most specifically Poland, and Belarus as well, as it appears that they are almost threatening to go to blows at the moment right now, and this could seriously begin to escalate as time goes by. We'll of course have to wait and see over the next several days how this is handled. We'll be getting to in a minute how the United States is trying to de-escalate the situation, but this isn't the only place we've seen the Russians try and violate the sovereignty of a NATO country. We also heard a similar story inside of Romania today, right outside and south of the Ukrainian city of Izmail. Izmail is one of the major ports that the Ukrainians have along the Danube River, and just south of that are a few small Romanian villages, and those villages are names which I cannot pronounce, but I will try. Plaru, right here directly along the other side of the Danube River, and then way further south, on another bend of the Danube River, is the village of Sitolchoy. I'm hoping that I'm saying that correctly, but nevertheless, this village's mayor came out in a statement today saying that Russian drones had not just blown out the windows inside of the houses of that village, but they had been observed to fly directly overhead on their attack path towards the port of Izmail. This has been quite a serious concern, and of course one that the Romanians have come out and immediately stated is not the case. The Romanian government says that that did not happen, although, once again, like the Polish situation, first-hand accounts from the ground in the area are confirming that those drones did fly over Romanian territory on their attack on Izmail. And this is, of course, once again, another massive escalation as far as NATO sovereignty is concerned, and once again, the Russians trying to push the envelope of what's possible as they continue to try and escalate the war not only with Ukraine and attack targets that haven't been attacked before, but to also try and ruffle the feathers of NATO countries by either getting their proxies like Belarus to try and desecrate border sovereignty, or to do it themselves with their very own drones attacking the town of Izmail. The United States, of course, is trying with all available efforts to stay off the escalations that are beginning to occur in between NATO countries on the NATO frontier and the Russians, as the United States came out with an official statement today during a press briefing saying, according to Matthew Miller, that there is a process for NATO countries to invoke Article 5. We are currently not in such a situation. And this is his comment on Poland's accusation of the Belarusian violation of the border with the 2 helicopters. That's, of course, the only attempt that we've seen publicly at the moment for the United States to try and quell the rising tensions in the region, but this is not going to end here. It clearly is not. It appears that more border violations are beginning to occur, not just inside of Poland, but inside of other NATO countries on that frontier, and this may be the beginning of further escalation in between the Ukrainians and the Russians. But enough talk on all of the external and international news going on. We'll be getting back to that in a minute. Many of y'all are here for the breaking news of the night that just came out while we were starting the stream. And that breaking news is that here in the south, near to the city of Bakhmut, just south of it on this battlefield, the Russians have now officially been pushed along the entire southern flank back to the railroad. That means that they have now lost the village of Andriivka, which we showed on the map as being partially owned by Ukraine, but up until this point today, it actually had not been controlled by Ukraine. We discovered that they have been pushed out of that position today, and they have also lost all or part of Kuzemivka. That is currently a bit of a mystery right now, but we will be making sure to update this frontline map so that way it accurately represents the conditions on the front. And so let me make sure that it lines up directly with the railroad tracks, because the railroad tracks are really the only defensive position that the Russians have in the southern flank at this point. It is an elevated berm that travels the entire length south of Bakhmut and is really the only place in the entire front line where the Russians can take refuge from Ukrainian direct fire and try and hide behind the berm, which kind of conceals them from Ukrainian view. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians have been able to barrage the Russians heavily, and this is what the front line, from what we understand from information that is coming out just right now, is looking like in that part of the front. And it is amazing news. This is absolutely incredible. This was a massive advance, certainly liberating the village of Andriivka, putting no doubt out there that Klishkivka has been completely liberated, and now it's up in the air as to whether Kuzemivka and the Russian garrison there has held over the past few hours or not. From what we understand, that is a 50-50 chance. We're not even going to be reporting that Kuzemivka has been liberated yet, because we don't really know. I've been trying to figure that out here in just the past few minutes. What we can understand is that the Ukrainians are currently fighting in Kuzemivka, but we don't understand if they have fought through Kuzemivka and out to the other side and into the open fields. That's something we do not know yet. But this is amazing news. And moving on directly into our Bakhmut news for the night, we'll be explaining why this is a big deal and also why further advances can most likely be expected in the southern flank compared to other parts of the battlefield. Of course, it appears, and let me make sure that we update this, that unfortunately Deep State UA is not showing this frontline update yet, although it has been confirmed by Ukrainian commanders in the field, and from what I saw, it appears that the 3rd Brigade commander was the one to make this statement. It was in writing. We'll be waiting for a video to then confirm that at a later date, most likely tomorrow or the next day. Nevertheless, this front line has completely changed, and over the past 24 hours, according to Deep State UA, no other flank has changed at this moment. We're seeing that the southern front appears to be the major axis of advance for Ukrainian forces in this area, and from what we understand, it is the most fruitful of them all. The Ukrainians have largely secured what they needed to in the northeastern area, which is control of the ridge line just north of the city of Bakhmut, because with this dominating position just in this one spot where the mouse cursor is, Ukrainian forces can look down into the city and fire into it, and also see Russians well before the Russians could really see Ukrainian forces. This also helps them to direct in artillery onto rear units in the background without having to call in a large number of drones to try and find these Russian forces, a massive benefit in the battle for the city itself. However, it appears that the large trapdoor action is actually occurring down here, and it appears that the Ukrainians are trying to push their way through the Klishchiivka, Andriivka, and Kuzemivka area on into the next line of defenses, which would be Zaitsevo, Opitne, and Kodyma, and then all the way around to the back, most likely near the area of Pokrovsk. If the Ukrainian forces are able to make it to the position of Pokrovsk, they will be cutting off the Russian garrison inside of the city of Bakhmut from any meaningful supply lines, and they'll also be threatening their position with encirclement, meaning that the Russians would be forced to withdraw from the city of Bakhmut, and the Ukrainians wouldn't have had to directly fight over the city block for block, street for street, like we saw the Russians do for nearly 9 months. And so, moving on into the footage that we've gotten from this area, we have about 3 clips that could be associated directly with the Southern Front. Our first one showed some Russian forces being hit and burning due to an attack from the 77th Air Mobile Brigade. We'll also be muting the Give Me a Beat Boy and Free My Soul, and we can see here that the Russians are burning. Oh, that sounds actually a little bit bad. The Russians are having an impromptu campfire.
With fireworks included.
Fireworks are included. It is like one of those beach bonfires that I've never been to. And we can see here that the fire continues to brew and burn, of course destroying Russian ammo due to the smoke being pure white. We found out early on in the war that if it is a normal fire, burning up just random objects, it usually burns a dark gray or a solid black. Solid black is almost always some kind of petroleum product. Ammunition always burns solid white. And we can see that due to this fire and the way it's burning, this is certainly an ammo dump that was inside of this house that has been hit and is now burning. We can see the fire continuing, and the destruction of this ammunition will most likely hinder Russian forces, much like any destruction of an ammo depot would, in ensuring that they are able to hold the front lines well. Russians will either burn through their ammunition and have no ammunition to work off of, or their quartermasters and sergeants, the few that they have, will be trying to ensure that they fire far less, meaning that they will have less of an ability to suppress the Ukrainians in a firefight, and therefore less of an ability to stop the Ukrainians from their continued push forward. The fire continues to burn with small explosions scattered about, meaning that the fire just reached a new ammo can or a new pile of ammo. And absolutely amazing to see that the Ukrainians, or specifically the 77th Air Mobile Brigade, was able to find this ammo dump, and not only that, but completely destroy it, once again hindering Russian forces in that area. Moving on towards the direction of Opitne, we also saw that the Ukrainians have been using their FPV drones to once again get some devastating hits on the large Russian units in the rear line. From what we understand, this was in the area of Opitne, and an FPV drone then hit the area and destroyed the Russian forces. We can see them loading some of their guys into a truck and now taking off, as one of them was left behind, of course. We can also see them driving by either a abandoned BMP of their own, or it's one that's pulled over for arrest. We're not really sure, but we can see this truck moving on down the road at a pretty good speed, kicking up a lot of dust.
That's the Charlie Chaplin truck or something that they borrowed?
Apparently so, and we can now see the truck coming up to a burned out and destroyed Scooby-Doo van, and the FPV drone goes straight through the windshield, right into the truck. And we now see another FPV drone coming in after the first one hit. And we can now see another drone observing from a distance after the truck has been hit, and we can see a plume of smoke coming from it after it has caught fire, and of course, an entire Russian squad was seriously hampered, I guess is the best way to put it, or knocked out completely. I'll leave it up to your imagination because we couldn't really see it. We're now going to be moving on into our third clip from the Southern Front, where we also saw the Ukrainians hitting some Russian forces with a mortar in this direction. And this was done by the 3rd Brigade of the Azov with some 82mm infantry mortars. We can see them here finding the Russian outposts in this area. And from what we assume, this tree line is somewhere in the area beyond the railroad burn. We can now see the Ukrainians loading the mortar rounds and preparing to fire, dropping the round, firing, and we can now see it landing onto that tree line. With some pretty accurate hits from the start, they didn't even really have to get a ranging shot because the ranging shot was actually dead on the target. We can see them continuing to hammer Russian forces and doing a pretty good job at it. Pretty accurate. I mean, if you can't get more accurate than that. Call these guys Chris Kyle because that's dead on the nail. And so with that, that's seeing that clip right there, but amazing to see that the 3rd Brigade was able to continue to destroy Russian forces in the area, and of course ensure that this new front line that we see down here was secured today. Of course, once again, resulting in further Russian losses of ground and vital strategic territory that would have helped them to hold this defensive otherwise. From what we understand, the Russian 72nd Brigade is still in the area and the one largely affecting this defense. The 72nd Brigade has been in a state of almost constant collapse for several months at this point, since around the time of March or April. And it appears that they have not been rotated off the line so far to bring in a fresh unit that would not be in as bad a shape of the 72nd. And it appears that the Russians have no intent to do anything about it, because once again, like we've covered before, the Russians have no strategic reserve at this point, and we can see that this is starting to become a critical factor for the Russian defense in the south of Bakhmut, as the 72nd is no longer able to effectively hold its defensive positions, and we're starting to see that the Ukrainians are making larger gains like the one today that was reported by the 3rd Brigade, and hopefully we'll see that they now are pushed beyond the railroad berm and towards Odrivka and Opitne, which are really the only other areas that they have in between their true second defensive line at Zaitsevo and Kodyma, and I'll show y'all why. We go all the way up to Bakhmut on Google Maps, and we try and take a good look at the front line. And so let me go find Bakhmut. There we go. And so if we look here, you can see that Kuzemivka was the largest village in between the Highway of Life back here at Ivanivsky and also the highway near Opitne and Odrivka. The issue with defensive positions in modern warfare is that they do revolve, at least from what we've seen in this war, around anchor points, and these anchor points are built-up areas. Built-up areas like Kuzemivka proved to be a vital Russian anchor point during the last part of the counteroffensive by the Ukrainians, but they've finally been able to overrun that position, and we can see that Andriivka, an incredibly small amount of village houses for the large part, did not really stand a chance once Kuzemivka fell. It isn't a proper anchor point because there's such a small area to disperse Russian forces in here that there is really no way to effect a proper defense. It may as well be putting the Russians inside of a tree line, like we see right outside of Andriivka, or into the open fields themselves. Not a proper anchor point. The only other area that is a proper anchor point along the length of the railroad tracks is Kuzemivka. It is a little bit smaller than Kuzemivka, but it's much more dense in the amount of houses, leading to more forces being spread out over a larger area, and therefore being a proper anchor point in a defensive. The problem with Odrivka and Opitne is that while Opitne is the very southern tip of the urban area of Bakhmut, and therefore can serve as an anchor point for Russian defenses, it can easily be bypassed in the field south near the area of Odrivka. One can see that Odrivka is literally a single street of village houses, and there's really nowhere to disperse Russian forces or to mount proper defensive positions in this area, and so really, once the Ukrainians push beyond the railroad berm and Andriivka, the Russians really don't have any hope to stop the Ukrainians effectively unless if they were to fall all the way back to Zaitsevo and Kodyma, and that means that the Ukrainians at that point would have officially made it behind Bakhmut. The highway, and let me make sure I get the name of it correct, which it's not giving me the name on this map, maybe it will on this one, the T0513 is really the divider in between being in front of Bakhmut or being behind Bakhmut. If the Ukrainians are able to push through Odrivka and onto the other side of the T0513, they will officially at that point be directly behind Bakhmut and will be poised, if taking the village of Zaitsevo, to push straight north and towards the area of Pokrovsk through the open fields, or to at least bring massive artillery fire against Russian supply lines in the rear near Pokrovsk, ensuring that the Russian forces here begin to be starved of ammunition and supplies that would help them to continue to hold the city of Bakhmut. And so, of course, the front line advances in the southern area around Kuzemivka have been massive today, and their implications are yet to really be seen yet, but I'm sure they are going to be absolutely massive in every single regard. And so with that, we're now going to be moving on into the only other 2 clips that we got from the Bakhmut area today, starting off with a very rare recovery vehicle being destroyed on film. This is a Brem L. This is based off of, from what I understand, some kind of a T-64 hull, and it is a Russian recovery vehicle meant to try and pull tanks out of the field. It will end up being one of the tanks that has to get pulled out of the field after the end of this video. And really quickly, correction everyone, this actually does not appear to be based off a T-64, but instead the hull of a BMP-3. So this is actually a fairly light recovery vehicle. But we can see them dropping a grenade, and it lands right into one of the hatches, exploding.
Easy work.
Easy. We make it look easy. And we can now see the...
Walk with your boys. Man, looks like hell inside of there.
Dude, you sit there, you go up to this tank, and you say, "Oh, Ruski, what are you doing?" "I'm hatboxing, Bliat." That is the Russian equivalent of hot box.
Just getting a taste of hell, Bliat.
I'm just getting a taste of where I'll go once this contract's over. Wait a minute, you're going to hell? No, I'm going back to Russia, but it's the same thing.
Yes.
But we can see a still picture of the fires burning inside the brim, and that thing is certainly brewing up, and it's a loss. Dang, it got so bad, you can see smoke coming out of the very few openings in the suspension on the bottom of the tank. Now that thing's burning warm. Call that thing a Dutch oven. No. This is a Russian oven. Yeah, it's a Russian oven.
A new type of oven where all your food gets scorched beyond belief.
Man, this is that kind of cooking that makes you go, so are we getting Chipotle tonight? That's the kind of oven you have right there. But with that, that's the end of that little video, and great to see a rare Brem recovery vehicle being destroyed. The Russians rarely ever bring out the recovery vehicles, as one can tell. They almost always abandon their tanks without the hopes of recovery, and so seeing one of those vehicles destroyed means that many other Russian tanks will be left without the chance of recovery. Moving on into the city of Bakhmut itself, we also saw that the 28th Brigade was also shelling Russian forces in the general area. This marker is not accurate to any specific location, but is more so representing the field of operations that the 25th is seen conducting in this video. And so without further ado, here's the clip. Oh, Chad, music ensues. And we can now see the infrared showing the artillery shells landing near the supply truck and then landing near some other areas as well, causing some pretty big fires. Oh, look at that. Oh, a toasty. That's a lot of lumens. And we can now see them shelling another Russian position. And actually, this area is so distinct, we might actually be able to tell where this is, and I'm getting a pretty good inclination. I think I know. It's the Kuzemivka salt flats. It looks a lot like it. Let's check again. And so you have a little lake over here. You have a big salt flat right there. Yeah, this looks like the general area. I would say it's probably looking somewhere around right here, if I had to assume. So y'all can see that the videos here in this clip, of course, have a wide range. It's not really all the way around the city of Bakhmut alone. It goes even as far south to Kuzemivka, near these open salt flats. And we can see the Russians getting shelled in this area. And we can also see some smoke coming from the trees. Grayish smoke, showing that something rarer than ammo is on fire in there. And we now see a car trying to turn on a bridge, and it just got shelled, so it's not making a three-point turn anymore. And we now see the Ukrainians blanketing an entire forested area, the 28th Brigade, of course, blanketing the area, and trying to destroy Russian forces inside of it. We can now see some kind of a vehicle burning on a road down there, and we can see some kind of a Oppenheimer-esque explosion in the distance, and from what this subtitle says...
Sarbomba.
Znishia. That's a BM-21 grad. Da Bokumiletki Broga. Unfortunately...
Are you actually reading what that says, or are you just making that up?
No, I actually can read Cyrillic a little bit. But I don't know what any of those words actually mean. So if you have a translator in the live chat that could help us out with what those words actually meant, I would be greatly appreciative. Because I don't know if they're saying that a grad hit that target in the distance, or if they destroyed a grad. That's kind of what I'm a little bit up in the air about. But we can see a massive explosion in the distance nonetheless. And that is one of those eon kind of explosions. I would assume that that's probably... Oh, wait a minute. This is way back there. Just in case y'all are wondering, that right there, the twin... Well, we don't want to say twin towers. That evokes bad memories. But the twin stacks back there are actually a part of a geothermal plant that I believe is as far back as Luhansk. I believe it's this one. Yeah, it's actually this one right here, it appears, near the area of Svitlodarsk. And I believe it's the Svitlodarsk geothermal plant. So we can see that the 28th Brigade has been blanketing an area about this big, where the mouse cursor is circling right here in this clip, and really destroying anything. And that also shows that the Ukrainians, at the moment, certainly have the ability to be striking at Russian supply lines right now. Maybe not with all of the artillery they have to bear, maybe just the larger artillery pieces, but nevertheless, the 28th Brigade is certainly reaching out far and hitting Russian forces that are probably around this area right here. And if we look at that again, we can see a little lake right there, and that might also key us in exactly where that is. There's a lake right there. So it appears that that explosion may have been about right there, actually, behind Zaitsevo and kind of towards the direction of the Svitlodarsk geothermal plant. But nevertheless, a massive explosion. We don't know what it is. I'm assuming it's certainly not a grad. I'm assuming that the grad hit that and then blew it up. And we now see some precise artillery strikes being conducted on other targets. And also, another interesting thing is that you can see the double-tracked railroad right there that leads into Bakhmut. And if I remember correctly, and let me make sure, and let's go to Google Maps here, the tree line in some areas is on this side, but we know that the Ukrainians clearly control this side. That's something that I believe Deep State even shows as well. So we go down the whole length of the tree line, well, the whole length of the railroad tracks, which we can see are double-tracked. We can't really find many areas where there is just a single lone tree line. And so let's look at that again, and let's see what's on the other side if we can tell. So I can't really tell what's over there. There's some kind of a brownish path. It looks like it may be a road, actually, but no other tree line. So if I had to say where that was, there's a couple of spots. It could have been right here, just about. There is a bit of a brownish area over here in a field, so it kind of matches up a little bit. Or it could have been about, well, it couldn't have been up here at all. So it's really only that one area right here. That may have been where that explosion occurred. But we couldn't really confirm that by seeing these small little lakes in the background near the railroad berm. Nevertheless, that video appears to show, once again, that the Russians are taking refuge on the eastern side of the railroad berm, once again confirming they have been pushed out of every other position, and they are now taking defensive positions behind the railroad berm. Of course, largely confirming the news we have today. We're still going to be waiting for more official video and picture evidence on this, but nevertheless, we wanted to be the ones to break the news first. With that, that's the end of that clip from the 28th Brigade, and absolutely nice to see that the 28th Brigade is hitting almost everything that you can virtually find in the area, and of course causing significant damage to Russian forces. Moving on from the city of Bakhmut and back into international news, now that we've covered most of the breaking news that we have in that area tonight, we're now going to be moving on into some other interesting things. Many of y'all may have noted that a lot of those videos we see in Bakhmut from the front lines are taken from Ukrainian drones, and drones in this war have become something of a massive social phenomenon. People are starting to believe in the abilities of drones a whole lot more because of this war than they ever have because of any other conflict. I feel at this point people have more fear of the DJI Mavic than they do of an MQ-9 Reaper at this point. It almost feels like that. And that is certainly something that we can see inside of Russia, because a drone was seen today over the city of Moscow. It was a DJI Mavic, and from what the story, well, how the story goes, from what I've heard, it was a drone piloted by a Russian. We're not really sure if it was piloted by a Russian operating for the Russian government, trying to take some kind of footage for a propaganda ministry, or whether it was just a normal Russian citizen flying his drone around. But nevertheless, a Russian drone took off to the skies today over Moscow, and people from the ground saw it, and they went into a stampede. You can't even make this stuff up. Here's the video. And when you see them running like their lives are on the line. Some of these folks are actually going to be breaking Usain Bolt's record, and there it is. They're about to zoom in on it. There's the DJI Mavic. It's just the normal DJI Mavic, and you can see it has nothing attached to it. It's just a normal Mavic. And in a second, you'll see it also fly off right there. But
Man,
people
those Russians are getting paranoid about drones.
Dude, people were going mental. They were freaking out over this. I mean, look at this. These folks are running like their lives depended on it. And it was just a simple drone. Like, you know, I don't think they're realizing it, but all of the drones that have attacked Moscow so far, they aren't piddly little Mavics. I mean, they're, from what we can tell, somewhat sizable drones. And these people are getting freaked out over just a normal store shelf drone that you can buy for about $2,000 or even less. I think they go for about $1,700 right now. But still, pretty sad to see. But of course, they have a little bit of a reason to be fearful inside of Moscow over attacks, whether they be from drones or whether they be from partisans, because a massive oxygen battery factory or battery storage near the area of Voskresensk or Kolomna, which is the larger settlement in that area, caught fire today and exploded, leading to a massive billow of toxic fumes, it appears, just due to the offish like eggshell color that the smoke has, started to billow into the air.
Ugh, that looks chemical.
That looks nasty. Like that little yellowish color that's in there every once in a while makes me feel like this probably smells like a paper mill. Like I would assume. I don't know what oxygen batteries smell like though, but this reminds me of those times, Matthew, when we used to live near paper mills and they would have this same colors of smoke and it would smell like absolute hell. It would smell like death or something even worse. And I remember we used to get bad migraines whenever they would start to release that smell into the area or it drifted our way. It was horrendous. But anyways, that is something interesting to note, and probably fueling the fires inside of the minds of Russian people as to why they should be scared of really any drone, because they're watching everything around the city get hit at this point by drones, things blowing up, things catching on fire, and then a random drone just pops up over your head and is whirring around and buzzing, and I think that's going to send people over the edge. They're already as tense as they get, and I wonder if they ever reflect on these instances here, you know, as innocent as they are, and think, when the Russians do it to Ukrainians, it's not that innocent because it's a Shahed 136 going right for their apartment block. But anyways, moving on from Moscow and really Russia as a whole, and moving on into some of our far western news inside of Ukraine, we've had an interesting view today of the SBU detaining some draft dodging facilitator. Some of y'all may or may not know this, but the market to try and smuggle Ukrainian fighting age men out of the country has become a little bit of an epidemic. There is a lot of money to be made in trying to transport these able-bodied men out, and some people are willing to pay big bucks. The SBU detained a man today who had been helping to facilitate people crossing the border, and of course bribing border guard officials to do so, and according to the information that the SBU was able to find, the price for this service was $10,000 per person. A massive amount. And we can see them arresting this man here in this clip. Opening up the door with a crowbar.
Oh, it's a lot of people.
Yeah,
or just one guy. Never mind.
And we can now see them arresting the man.
So the Ukrainians are going around doing this to, like, individual people like that? And in these big operations?
Yeah, I think these aren't really like massive operations. I feel like this is kind of like a one-off thing. Like this guy may have a friend who's a border guard, and so he, you know, like told him the idea, hey, what if I try and get people out of the country and I give you a cut of the money and I keep a cut and we get these folks out of here so that way we can make a profit. And then the border guard agreed with him. I think it may be a person-to-person thing and kind of more so not a massive criminal outfit, but just, you know, little arrangements from person to person that are making this happen. But it's great to see that they are arresting these people and trying to stop this, because this has been a bit of a big deal. And that's also why sometimes you see some able-bodied Ukrainians outside of Ukraine, and you wonder, well, how in the world did they get out here? And a lot of people always want to give the benefit of the doubt that, oh, they're out here because they got permission. But sometimes that's not the case, and it's a lot more sinister underneath the actual story, and they were actually dodging drafts or something similar. And I think that's great to know that the SBU is, of course, stopping this stuff from happening, because draft dodging is one of the, in my opinion, one of the ultimate betrayals of one's country. This country has raised these people, have put in their time and effort. The resources of the entire nation was put into these men's upbringing, and for them to decide, after all of this blood, effort, and toil has been put into raising them and allowing them to live in this country with everyone else, they decide to just pack up their bags and leave. And folks like these are more than happy to allow something like this to happen as long as they're able to make a profit off of it. And so, great to know that the SBU is cracking down on this stuff, and hopefully we see that there are less desertions from Ukraine for that reason. And of course, I'm not trying, and one thing I'd like to make clear is that from what we understand, the amount of Ukrainians that are trying to flee the country illegally and draft dodge is somewhat low from what we understand. I believe it's only a few thousand a month, which sounds somewhat big, but when you put that into the large scale, it's honestly a drop in the bucket. Nevertheless, it is important to make sure that people do not get the idea that they can leave, and also that it's just against the law in Ukraine, or really any country, to try and dodge a draft. So with that, we're going to be moving on from that little bit of news near Lviv, and on into our next bit, where we saw that an L-39 Albatross was in training. And we can see here a picture of two L-39 Albatrosses taking off from an airfield in close formation, and these are some of the training aircraft of the Ukrainian Air Force, although they can be outfitted with some light armaments and used to attack Russian military forces, although that's advised against, because these are fairly less complicated aircraft, or fairly less sophisticated aircraft. They are just pure jet trainers as far as they go, and so trying to use them outside of that role is not advised, but they do have a little bit of a role in a very interesting thing that may be going on here through the future, perhaps, or maybe even towards something that'll be coming around in a few months' time. And of course, not to sit here and try and, build up the massive news, but a statement has come out from President Volodymyr Zelensky today saying that training of Ukrainian pilots on the F-16s will begin later this month. And that means that we can expect that the first Ukrainian pilots will sit down into the seats of the F-16s by the end of the next 20 or so days, and will begin training on these aircraft in hopes of bringing them into Ukraine, most likely by the winter time or the early spring of next year. This is massive news, and I think that it's absolutely incredible to hear that there is some kind of an actual path for the Ukrainians to get trained and then use the F-16s at some point in the future. And this is the most definitive news we've heard about it so far. And so huge news, and hopefully we'll see these in operation and over the skies of Ukraine at some point in the future. And so with that, we're now going to be moving on from that little bit of news in Kyiv, and we're now going to be moving on into our location unknowns. And we've had some incredibly interesting ones, but some interesting stuff I've seen, and a poll actually just went up on one of the interesting topics, is that a lot of y'all have been having a lot of opinions about many different kinds of things. Especially one of the most recent things that I've been talking about, which is the draft dodgers and their facilitation of crossing the border through some of these middlemen, like we just saw being arrested by the SBU. And that appears to be something of a contentious topic. Many people are saying that those people are traitors. Some people are saying that I should join the military, because that just, is a part of the conversation for some reason. Nevertheless, many of y'all have had many different things to say about a lot of the topics and a lot of the news that we've brought up so far. And because of that, we've been looking at it, and we've been wondering, if we were to put all of this up to a vote, what were y'all actually thinking? What are the majority of y'all believing about some of these certain instances, topics, and news? And so, what do we got, Matthew?
All right, so we have a lot of really good questions and quite a few polls for our first segment tonight. And our very first poll says, reports suggest that North Korea is considering providing military aid to Russia, and what are your thoughts? 80% said they have already been providing it, 11% said it's certainly possible and maybe, 6% said North Korea won't provide anything, and 3% said unsure. And on this one, I have no doubt that North Korea has been providing some kind of military aid up to this point to Russia. It's probably most likely scraps, nothing high-tech or advanced, but of course, North Korea does have some old weaponry that they can give to Russia, and I think they've already been doing it. But that's my speculation. Enforcer, what say you?
I would say that the North Koreans are certainly providing support, but I don't really think that the North Koreans can provide a massive amount of support because they are greatly hindered by their own limitations. They are dirt poor. And so with that, I hope that does address that fairly well. And with that, we are on to the next one.
All right, and I can't wait to get to the last poll. I'm actually shocked at the contention around that question. But anyways, our second poll says, Poland says Wagner's new mission from Putin is to destabilize NATO's eastern flank, and what are your thoughts? 62% said yes, it appears to be true. 18% said, it's possible, but it seems kind of wild. 13% said no, Wagner can't do very much, and 7% said unsure. And I do believe that Wagner's new mission is definitely to destabilize the eastern flank. I think they're trying to create a problem with NATO, but they're staying kind of careful not to cross the line too much because they really don't want a war. But their objective is to cause fear in both Poland and now Lithuania. And it appears they're doing that decently well. But Enforcer, what say you?
And can you reread that poll prompt again for me?
And it says, Poland says Wagner's new mission from Putin is to destabilize NATO's eastern flank, and thoughts?
I would say that it may be. We're seeing that they're already causing a lot of hell just from them being on the border alone. So that may actually be their new objective given to them by the Belarusians or the Russians, is to start to try and sow pandemonium, fear, and distrust amongst a lot of NATO countries and what's going on in the border area. And so with that, I hope that does address that one fairly well, and we are on to the next one.
And our next one says, Lithuania says that Wagner PMC has begun moving toward their border in recent days, and what are your thoughts? 72% said it's part of Wagner's new mission that we just mentioned, 15% said it's not an issue, Wagner is weak, 10% said unsure, and 4% said, seems somewhat mundane. And I don't think it's mundane whatsoever. Wagner is definitely a threat. It's not as big of a threat as Poland is trying to make it out to be, but it is still nonetheless a imminent threat. They have to address it. And I think that simply shoring up the border security will probably take care of that issue for the most part. But of course, it's not a threat as major as it's being made out to be. But Enforcer, what say you?
I would actually have to disagree. I think Wagner is a very serious threat, but not in the way we have viewed Wagner before. A lot of people are viewing Wagner right now on whether they're a threat or not, based off of them being a conventional fighting force like we saw inside of Ukraine. But from how I'm viewing it, and I believe how the Polish are viewing this and why it seems to be a serious issue, is that the Wagner is no longer heavily armed, but they could prove to be a subversive force attempting to conduct espionage, spying, or further reconnaissance on NATO and NATO forces along the Polish border, or even inside the Baltic states as well, which could seriously hamper or hinder the operational security of NATO forces, and also our ability to respond to the Russians if they were to try and launch a preemptive attack in that area rapidly. Of course, we would always counter the Russian attack and end up winning. That would just be obvious due to spending power, military size, technological advances, and everything else. But they could get a they could get an upper hand first due to the Wagner being able to exfiltrate the border area by trying to blend in with refugees that they're once again trying to push across the border from Belarus. And that could be something very serious. And so I think that the Polish are completely within their right to make the Wagner seem like a serious threat, because if used properly and used in that way, I could see them being an incredibly serious threat by all means. And so with that, I hope that does address that fairly well in my opinion. And with that, we are on to the next one.
All right, and our next poll says, should NATO take every possible measure to avoid war with Russia? It looks like 39% said yes, and it's a smart approach, while 39% also said no, we cannot afford to be weak. 19% said I'm mixed on this one, and 3% said unsure. And this is an age-old debate when it comes to foreign policy. The policy of appeasement versus a hardline approach. And it's always been very contentious, or at least from what I've seen. On this one, it is kind of hard to tell. Because at this point in the world, everyone pretty much has nuclear weapons. All the major powers do. Russia has them, the U.S. has them, and NATO has them as well, along with China. So now the stakes are much higher than they used to be, and world war would be quite devastating if nukes started flying. So with the stakes being so much higher, that changes things quite a bit. It's a little bit more difficult to take an extremely hardline stance, and I think we've seen with Poland sort of somewhat trying to ignore the helicopter incursion, as well as Romania trying to ignore the attacks right on their border. I think it seems that NATO wants to try to avoid war at all costs at the moment. But of course, that might change at any moment, considering any new intel that they might get. But Enforcer, what say you?
I would say, what happened? Reread the line.
Should NATO take every possible measure to avoid war with Russia?
No, I don't think we should. Because that would be spineless, and at that point, we may as well just give up Ukraine, because we're not going to ever make a stand on anything. I think that there should be hard lines. And of course, I'm not saying that, we just sit there and stop the Russians from doing everything. We can allow them to do some things, because we don't want to go to war over tiny, minor things. But nevertheless, there has to be some kind of a line drawn that they cannot cross. And I think that at some point, we need to put our foot down. We can't allow the Russians to do whatever they want just to try and avoid a war, because then we end up being the League of Nations in the 1930s facing down Hitler. Yeah, sure, why not let them annex Austria in the Anschluss? That'll never prove to be a problem. Yeah, sure, we can give them the Sudetenland, as long as they guarantee that there'll be peace. Oh, well, they annexed all of Czechoslovakia and now have created a puppet state out of Slovakia and have just outright annexed all of the modern-day Czech Republic. That's no big deal. We can let that slide. Oh, wait a minute, now they want Poland. And then by that point, they have been able to build up a massive industrial base inside of territories that they never had before. And not only that, we're able to build up their military over several years. And instead of having to take these areas by force of arms, they just got them signed over to them by treaty and agreement. And that shows, and I believe throughout all of history, appeasement has been shown to be a very weak path to take at every single turn. It's something that people with no, I don't want to be brutal about that because that was about to come out very brutally. It's something I believe that is spineless. And sure, you can do a little bit of appeasement here and there, and you can give a little bit here and there, but you can't do that nonstop. Because at that point, you end up losing everything because nothing's worth fighting for. And so I would say that NATO should have some lines, and I believe that one of those lines has almost been crossed right now with those Belarusian helicopters flying over the border. And I believe that it should be put out in precedent that if any Wagner forces are captured inside of NATO territory, if they have tried to breach the border area and make it into Poland or any Baltic states, that they will not be treated as actual combatants or spies of a country. They will be treated as saboteurs, and according to international law, saboteurs can be executed on the spot. And so with that, I hope that does address that fairly well, and with that, we are on to the next one.
So I do have a question for you on your position on that one. I do understand completely that appeasement in this circumstance is undesirable. I want to say that is clear right off the bat. Russia is a bully, and bullies don't respond to weakness. It never works, it never has worked, and probably never will. But considering that they do have nuclear weapons, and the risk is very high that they could use them if a world war or a bigger conflict broke out, you would still say to take a hardline stance.
Yes, I would say to take a hardline stance because, like, for example, let's look at one time that the U.S. took a hardline stance and these same stakes were at risk. We took a hardline stance like this in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it actually ended up paying off because we got nuclear weapons out of Cuba, but of course we did compromise and also remove our nuclear weapons out of Turkey. But nevertheless, we took a hardline stance and said that is completely unacceptable at that moment in time, knowing the stakes, and the stakes were as high or even higher back then than they are now, and it ended up succeeding. There has to be some kind of a line that we do not allow to be crossed at some point. And I believe that the Cuban Missile Crisis shows that whenever those times do arise, you can actually stop them from doing what they want without having to give up everything and go, oh, nuclear weapons just 90 miles south of the Florida coast is just going to be acceptable, and we'll let that slide to avoid further conflict.
Maybe. In this instance, I have to say the helicopter incursion into Poland, it was certainly a major violation of their airspace, but I would not say that would be grounds enough to start a large conflict like a world war, because if it was something where people were killed or injured, that's another story. Also, you got to remember that at some point, a missile did fly into a NATO country. It exploded. I think it might have injured someone or destroyed some buildings, and we completely overlooked it then as well, and didn't start a world war into that. So I think there's worse things that's happened in the past that they could have done that on, and NATO hasn't done it yet, indicating that they aren't ready for a world war. And I would have to say that I think that we should avoid that at all costs until something horrific happens, because that could be very devastating. It could end basically Western civilization.
Perhaps, but I think we'll just have to agree to disagree on that one, because I still think
I'll disagree to agree.
Oh, you'll just... Oh, really? Oh, okay. Well, with that, we are on to the next one. If I'm correct, the next one is probably the most talked about one in the live chat so far.
Yes, it is. And it is the most contentious one and the most voted on poll of the night thus far. And it's very contentious. I'm shocked. Do you agree with Ukraine arresting men trying to leave the country at this stage in the war? 64% said yes, I don't support draft dodging. 18% said no, I don't support these arrests. And 18% said unsure. So 18% said I don't support the arrests. So on this one, it appears the most prevalent argument for not supporting these arrests is that people don't feel people should be forced to fight in a war that they don't want to fight. I do understand that sentiment. However, that's not good for the entirety of Ukraine. And the law in Ukraine right now has been suspended. Martial law is still in effect, I do believe.
Yes.
And yes, it is. And in that case, I would say it's justified that they're forcing people to stay and fight. Now, one thing I would disagree with is people should not be forced into a combat role. Some people aren't built for that, and they simply cannot handle it. But there are other ways these people can serve in the Ukrainian military without going into a combat role, and they don't have to flee to avoid, serving whatsoever. But with that caveat, in general, I don't support draft dodging. I think that's wrong. But Enforcer, what say you?
I would have to say I do not support draft dodging at all. And this is something that I know a lot of people are very contentious about, and a lot of people bring up Vietnam. But the thing is that Vietnam's a little bit of a different story, because Vietnam's draft was a draft that was brought forward for a war that we didn't really have to be involved in. It wasn't a defensive war involving the fate of the nation. It was more so a peacekeeping operation would really be a bad way to put it. It was more of a strategic play to try and stop the spread of communism through Southeast Asia, and then the draft was brought forward for that reason. So it's a completely different reason. In this instance here, and other instances that I'll bring up, the drafts were involved for the defense of nations. In the First World War and the Second World War, every single Allied power would have a draft of some form because they were attempting to defend either themselves or they were responding to an attack. The United States was directly responding, when we started the draft, to Pearl Harbor on December 7th, which was an attack upon our country, and so the war was a defensive war where we were trying to stop an expansionist Japan from dominating the United States and also conquering territories and land that was ours at the time, including the Philippines, Hawaii, and other islands that we had in that area. The British, of course, brought forward the draft in the First and Second World Wars because the French in the First World War were directly under threat, and also the British had a treaty with Belgium, and therefore they had an invested interest in defending those areas, and also the Germans started to conduct unrestricted submarine warfare, and were also attacking British shipping at the time, so that made sense in the defensive war. And in the Second World War, of course, the Germans were directly threatening the British with invasion and conquering through Operation Sea Lion, and also the subsequent fall of France that came before Operation Sea Lion was even brought about. All of those wars are defensive wars, and a citizen has an obligation, especially considering that almost all of the countries that I just brought up were a democracy, or could be considered a democracy of a form. I know so many people are about to say the U.S. isn't a democracy. Yeah, it is. Just go pull up what a democracy is, and Federal Republic falls under that umbrella. The British are a constitutional monarchy, but the monarchy really doesn't have any actual power, or they're a benevolent monarchy, so they don't exercise any of their constitutional rights. So it is largely, once again, a democracy, because the members of Parliament make almost all of the decisions, and the House of Lords almost never gets in the way of that either, although they are an unelected body. A citizen of a democracy has a duty, an actual obligation, to defend the country they are a part of. They grew up in that country, they lived in that country, and therefore it is their responsibility, it is their duty to defend the country that they are in. And, and whether people like the idea of that or not, because it sounds pretty forceful, it is something that must be done. A lot of the soldiers in the Second World War that you saw in those films that were racing forward through France, those weren't volunteers. A lot of those were draftees that were drafted because the U.S. Army needed more men. And that's how wars go. That's just a part of life. And some people, of course, like to say their response, well, why don't you join the Army? Well, the problem with that argument is that the United States isn't in a war for its existence right now, so it wouldn't really make sense to volunteer for the Army, because that's not being drafted. In case of anyone.
If we get drafted and sent to Ukraine, that means a world war has broken out, which would be an entirely different situation.
And some people are also probably going to say, well, why don't you see about getting drafted? Well, the thing is that in the United States, it's required by law that once you turn the age of 18 for a male, you must register for the Selective Service, which is registering for a draft if it was ever to happen. And then,
I registered.
Yeah, and we both registered, of course, because if you don't register, I believe you're either fined or you can be put in prison.
Oh, you go to prison, I do believe.
I think there's actually a fine out there. I think they try and fine you a couple of times before they just throw you in the slammer. But
Man, you go to the federal pen over that one.
Oh yeah, you go to federal prison, which I don't think there's really any way to get paroled out of federal prison. You just serve the whole sentence almost entirely.
Yeah, it's hard time.
Yeah, so so we've of course signed up for the Selective Service, and if for some reason the government ever called me up to serve, that's what I have to do. It's not really my place to say whether I agree with whatever the government's doing or what the war is. As a citizen of this country and a citizen of this republic, living in a democracy that is supposed to be representative of the people, it only makes sense that the military would draw upon those very people to defend the nation in times of conflict. That would just seem to make sense to me. And one thing that's interesting to me is that people are very vocal in the live chat against being drafted, but then the polls show that a large majority of people don't support draft dodging. It's a very interesting mix because a lot of people who aren't, well, the small group that aren't for draft dodging, it's just very weird, and I'm putting that in a very bad way, and I don't think it's ever going to make sense because I don't think I'm going to get the wordage right to get that out. But nevertheless,
I think if you put it in perspective for the United States, if the U.S. was directly under attack, surely you wouldn't want to sit back and just wait for, whatever's going to happen. You'd want to get involved and go try to defend your country, or at least that's what I would want to do.
And also, let's see, and someone said, no, they don't enforce the registration. I'm pretty certain that they would. It's kind of like saying that the IRS wouldn't come after you if you didn't pay your taxes. They will eventually come after you. You may get away with it for a few years, but they are going to get you nevertheless. And I can't really see, and I'll say this. I am always a huge optimist on this channel about the United States, and I believe that the United States is a great place. But that doesn't mean that I sometimes have disagreements with what the government does in certain instances, and I'm not getting into that on stream, but I have my own beliefs. Nevertheless, if this country, regardless of who was in charge or what was going on, if I was called up in a draft, I would go. That's just it's your duty as a citizen of your country to go into the military if you're called up in a draft. And people sit there, oh, well, what about Agent Orange? That stuff, like about Vietnam. What about Agent Orange? And what about all that? That's just stuff you have to deal with. And also, I don't really like the idea of freeloading. It's like, oh, the draft applies to everyone else, but not to me. Not to me. I'm not going to go because I don't feel like it. I'm going to let everyone else in the country go and fight to defend it, so that way I can just sit on my laurels and live off the fruits of everyone else's labor in defending the nation I'm living in. That also seems...
I think that's why people are opposed to the draft is because of the Vietnam era, which is understandable because in my opinion, obviously it's going to vary depending on, what your beliefs are. That draft was not preferable, just to put it lightly, and that also caused a lot of people to become adverse to the draft. Obviously, the draft during the World War is very clearly justified because we're in a fight for our survival as the West against a very evil force. But in Vietnam, it was arguable whether or not that was justified or not.
Well, and I honestly don't think the draft in Vietnam was justifiable because drafts are supposed to be brought about in defensive wars where it's necessary that more men are needed. Vietnam was a war that wasn't defensive in any right. We were defending a country that wasn't ours, so it doesn't really make sense to call forward a draft for something that isn't an existential crisis to the nation. So the Vietnam, and I see what people are getting at there. The Vietnam draft is something that I would have, kind of been like, well, what the hell am I getting drafted for? I still would have gone, but that's something that I just didn't really get at all about the Vietnam draft. Nevertheless, if your country is at threat or has been attacked, I think it's completely justifiable that there be a draft called up and folks serve. And also, if you believe in, and here's a little bit of an argument to be made about people not really supporting the draft. If you don't support the draft, do you support Ukraine? Because Ukraine has been drafting and conscripting men for this war ever since day one. A lot of those soldiers you see on film are conscripts that were brought, well, not really conscripts, but draftees that were brought forward from conscription. And so do you support Ukraine, or do you now condemn Ukraine because they're drafting soldiers for their defense when it's an existential crisis? Or would you rather have all of those guys run across the border into Poland and allow Ukraine to fall and still tout the banner of Ukraine? I support Ukraine, but I don't support their government trying to ensure that their nation survives until next week. Everyone ought to be able to run for the hills. Is that what we're going with now, or what? To be honest with you, my opinion on it is that I don't really support draft dodging, especially in instances where it's in the defense of your own nation. I don't really support draft dodging, even if it's just called up. I think that should be a serious question and a serious debate, that drafts should not be called up unless if it's a defensive war that has some kind of an existential crisis to your nation. But nevertheless, the draft is the draft and the law is the law. And I wouldn't be one to sit there and say, I'm going to let everyone else die, but I'm going to run for the hills. That just seems to be very selfish and kind of freeloading on the benefits that every other citizen is going to strive to give to everyone else. With that, I hope
And also, real quick, I'm going to make this short because I see folks want us to move on. But I see some folks saying that the Vietnam draft, for example, it drafted, not the rich people or the people that have connections and stuff like that. Sadly, that's always going to happen no matter what. That's just the way any country and any government works. Some people are going to have connections and ways to get out of it, and some people aren't. While it's not good that happens, it's just a unfortunate fact that we're going to have to accept, because otherwise, how do we solve that? There's really no way to solve it.
And also, someone just said, what would your parents think if you were drafted to fight on another continent in a proxy war? Well, they would probably think that's crow, and I would agree, that's just crow, but at the same time, I don't really think that it's my place as a citizen to go, everyone else can go, rules for thee, not for me. If this country is on the premise, and of course, Matthew's got, and a lot of people have a point, a lot of the rich kids, they don't go, because their parents find ways to make sure that they don't go, or their connections make sure that they don't go, one or the other. And that is something that I think is pretty jacked up, I'll agree. But at the same time, I don't think that I should sit there and go, the rich people who have connections, they're getting out of the war, so I should get out of the war too. I believe in what we do. I believe in the democracy that the United States is supposed to be, in the laws that it lays out. And so if they call me up in a draft, whether I agree with it or not, I feel like you have to go. That's just how I.
But just look, if you were a senator, let's say you're a parent, you're like a father, for example, that's a senator, and your two kids could potentially get drafted, but you have a way to potentially get them out of it with your connections. Most people, even though they object to that when they hear it, if they were in that position, they'd probably do the same thing too. It's unfortunate, it's not fair, but it does happen.
And I would agree. But regardless, it is your belief at the end of the day whether you think draft dodging is okay or not okay. But remember that a lot of the war in Ukraine right now, and the fact that Ukraine has been able to exist so long and raise enough forces to actually fight the Russian army on a level playing field, is because they are drafting men, and those men aren't running into Poland. They are staying and they are joining the Ukrainian army. And so just keep that in mind. There wouldn't be any I support Ukraine if it wasn't for those men who accepted the draft and then joined the Ukrainian army to defend their nation. There wouldn't be an argument. The war would have been over before this argument ever even came around. And so with that, I hope that does address that fairly well, at least as much as we can, because we've been on that for a good bit. But with that, let's get on into the chats.
All right, and moving into our first Super Chat question, we have a very generous $100 donation from Rob Eisman. And thank you very much, Rob, for that support. Hey! And also, good to see you once again. And he says, I understand the mentality of draft dodging. Unfortunately, I know that once your wing is dipped in blood, it never comes off, and you will never be that same person, never. However, abandoning your own country, no way to justify such action. And he says, you can serve without taking life. And exactly, I agree with that 100%.
And I would agree with that completely, Rob. And that's one thing that I didn't really touch on a lot, is that, of course, military service changes people. A lot of those brave men in the First and Second World War that were drafted and went overseas, they would come back completely different people, completely changed by their experiences, and sometimes still able to remember, even decades later, the smell of the battlefields that they were on and the putrid reality of living in such a hell. But nevertheless, and I know that this sounds aloof, but I promise you all it's not trying to be aloof. That is life. That is part of living in a country like ours, or really any other country, is that if it is threatened, one will have to endure such hardships and difficulties so that way one has a nation to live in at all. And so thank you so much once again for the mass amount of support, Rob, and helping this channel to keep on running. And I would agree with those sentiments pretty much entirely. And so with that, thank you so much once again for the mass amount of support. I hope that does address that the best I can. And with that, we are on to the next one. And thank you so much for the massive support and helping this thing to keep on rolling.
Yes, indeed. And up next, we have a $30 super chat from Drunky Monkey. And thank you very much, Drunky, for that support once again. And it said, live chat question, please. And Slava Ukraine. And thank you very much for that support. And we will grab a live chat question. And it goes to Jason, who says, Enforcer, is the Russian rebel army still a factor as you don't hear about them anymore?
The Russian Liberation Army is still a factor. It's just that we haven't seen them conduct a border raid in a bit. They raided the area around Shebekino in this area and almost made it to Belgrade, and then they left at some point. We don't know when, and we don't know when they're coming back either. So they're not completely gone, but they kind of have faded into the background a little bit. And so with that, I hope that does address that fairly well. And thank you for sponsoring that live chat, Drunky Monkey. And with that, we are on to the final question of this segment, and then we're going to be moving on into the location unknowns and the rest of the frontline news we have today.
All right, and the last one goes to George A., who puts in a $20 donation. And thank you very much, George, for that support. He says, should former Ukrainian and Polish areas of Belarus be returned? It's really not that much, and maybe the city of Brest-Litovsk, which is the town which sponsored the 1596 return of the Western Orthodox Ukrainian Church to Rome.
I've got to be quite honest. I don't think that the Ukrainians should have any claims outside of their 1991 borders, because then they're doing the same things that the Russians are doing that we're condemning them for. Is that the Russians say that several hundred years ago we controlled Ukraine as the Russian Empire, and so we need that back. And that's something that just doesn't really exist in the modern day. The borders that exist now, I'm largely a fan of keeping them that way in Europe. And also, a lot has culturally changed since then as well. Brest, as it is now, not Brest-Litovsk, but just Brest, it's now called that only, is largely a Belarusian city. There's really no Ukrainians living there anymore because over hundreds of years, they have either been removed from the area forcefully and then brought into Ukraine, so that way there was a Belarusian Brest instead of a Ukrainian one inside of the country, Belarus. And many other things have happened as well. That's why it doesn't really make sense historically in the modern day to say that East Prussia and a decent part of Poland should be given back to Germany, because historically it was a part of Germany for 1,000 years, because there are no Germans living there anymore. They were either fled the area when the Soviets were coming through, or they fled afterwards into East Germany and then into West Germany, or they were forcibly removed and then put into East Germany by the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union to try and create culturally homogenous countries after the fact. So I wouldn't really see an argument for Ukraine getting additional territory, because then we're starting to try and argue the same things that the Russians are arguing in their invasion of Ukraine. And so with that, thank you so much once again for the support, and I hope that does address that fairly well. And thank you so much once again for helping this channel to keep on rolling. And with that, it is now time for us to move on out of that very long poll and question segment, and now back into the location unknown. Starting off with our first little bit of news, which was very interesting, showing a infographic of the amount of weapons that were transferred from Ukraine and into Russia. According to this, Ukraine transferred 1,067 missiles to Russia, and this was the equipment and weapons transferred by Ukraine to Russia under the Budapest Memorandum. 4,200 tactical nuclear weapons, 581 Kh-55 cruise missiles, 176 ICBMs, 42 Tu-95s and Tu-160 strategic bombers, and then later on in 2000, 386 additional Kh-22 missiles would be transferred back over to Russia, and then from 1992 to 2014, they would further transfer another 166 engines entirely for parts, 100 X-59M missiles, 31 aircraft, 4 missiles and missile launchers, and a single Mi-8T. That's actually a lot of stuff that they transferred due to the Budapest Memorandum when you spell it out like that. And it makes you wonder, I wonder who that should have really inherited that. I think what would have been better, looking back, of course, hindsight being 2020, is that the United States should have made a separate agreement with the Ukrainians that they would help them to denuclearize all of these weapons, but also ensure that the Russians don't end up inheriting any of these weapons, because while a lot of these would still end up being denuclearized and demilitarized, there are still a decent amount of these equipments and weapons that still exist inside of Russia to this day that were handed over to them in 1994 due to the Budapest Memorandum. But with that, we're going to be moving on to our next bit of location unknown news, where we also saw a CV-90 column on the move, and it was really cool to see. Here's the clip, and check it out. When you see the CV-90 column, I've got to admit, I think the CV-90 is probably one of the coolest looking infantry fighting vehicles out there.
It's pretty cool.
It's pretty cool, I'm not going to lie. And so with that, that's the end of that clip right there. And we're now moving on to the next one, where we also saw 2 Russian soldiers were captured today in an unknown location.
Передаем привет украинским создателям БПЛА. Вы самые лучшие. Вы самые лучшие. Небо ваше просто. Не даете ходу даже.
Понравилось вам, да? Да. Охуенно понравилось. КамАЗ понравился тебе, блядь?
We see them continuing to talk to the Russian prisoners. This guy appears to be out of it. But with that, that's the end of the clip. And great to see that they were able to make sure to capture 2 extra Russians. Very nice to see. Moving on from that, we also saw something pretty interesting. I just had to put a question mark on this one as its title, because I don't even know what the hell this guy was thinking. Here's a Russian. There's an anti-tank mine. What else can I say? Watch the video. Hey, look, Evan, it's still alive. And
oh, wow, I just went and grabbed it.
I don't even know what he did, but he set it off. He's like, hey, Ivan, check out this magic trick. I can make myself disappear. Watch. Poof. And he's just gone.
Yeah, that disappearing might not actually be a joke, to be honest, in this situation. That seemed almost intentional.
Dude, I think he gone. The Darwin Award winner right there in the flesh. But with that, we're now going to be moving on, or more so with the lack of flesh, but moving on from that and into the Russian casualty report. The losses have been significant.
Oh, today. Yes, sir. They got 3.
Baba boy! And let's see if we got any memes. Hey, KJ, 3 for Matt. Hey! Brenda, 3 for Matt. Hey! Melissa Smith, 3 for Matt. Hey! Edward, 3 for Matt. Newt, 3 for Matt.
Let's go.
Lauren, 3 for Matt. Brad, 3 for Matt. Loads of them. Loads of memes. Very nice to see. Enforcer Matt dancing in the hall. And very nice.
Hey!
Hey, look at me getting jiggy with it. But anyways, 3 special equipment vehicles were destroyed today. One of them was most likely that brim we saw blow up earlier. And the losses were high in every category today. 620 Russian soldiers were taken out over the past 24 hours, 21 armored personnel carriers, 23 supply trucks, 7 tanks, 26 artillery pieces, 35 drones, 4 MLRSs, and 2 anti-aircraft warfare systems. All in all, a pretty impressive amount of losses, and I have to say, absolutely wonderful to know that the Ukrainians have been able to inflict such large losses on the Russian forces today, and, of course, making sure to whittle down those Russian frontline forces until they can eventually push them out of their positions. Moving on from the location unknowns and on into the northeastern area, there were no frontline advances to speak of today, but we did see some action as the 8th Brigade thwarted a Russian attack near Kupiansk. And so here's the clip. Alright, cool, and we're going to be muting that, and we can now see the little path that the Russians have been taking. It's a little worn, and we can now see the Russian trench right here. And look at that. And they're about to be dropping the bomblet right into the trench. We can see one of the Russians right there clearly. And there goes the bomblet. And poof. And there goes the Russian.
Chugga chugga.
What a quiet chugga chugga. Chugga chugga. And so with that, that's the end of the clip right there. And we are now going to be moving on from that little bit of news. Great to see the 8th Mountain Brigade was able to hit a Russian trench in that area. And we're now going to be moving on down to the area of Kuzemivka, or more specifically, noted in these clips, Novoselivsk. This area has been a pretty heavily contended battlefield for a while. It's on the road leading to Svatove, and it appears that the Russians attempted to conduct some kind of a minor offensive today with a battalion tactical group. And from what we can tell over these next 2 video clips, they would be thwarted completely by the Ukrainian defensive forces. And so here's the first clip around Novoselivsk of around 4 tanks being repelled after they try to attempt an offensive in the area. We're going to be meeting that, but we can see some kind of a recovery vehicle or an anti-tank vehicle. And we now see the Russian tanks booking it as they're leaving the area after one of their own appears to have been hit right there in that red box. We can now see the tank burning and brewing up after it was hit by Ukrainian fire. And it appears that the Ukrainians were able to thwart this little attack and also roast a Russian tank. Eyewitness accounts say that they roasted that Russian tank by clapping their hands and going, "What are those?" And then the tank just blew up. But great to see that they were able to roast one nonetheless. We're now going to be moving on into our next little bit of location unknown news from Twitter, where we saw that additional Russian tanks were destroyed in the area. And it appears that there's no audio, but we can see the Russian tank being highlighted with a red square, also coming from the red square, and we can now see the tank getting hit. That honestly appears to actually be the same tank, just from a different angle with another drone, and we now see it circling over the burning out wreck. And of course, this one hit on the lead tank stopped the entire offensive. We can now see the clip we just saw a second ago. And we can see the tanks once again retreating off the field after the lead vehicle was hit. And we can see it roasting again. But absolutely great to know that the Ukrainians were able to thwart a small offensive effort by the Russians in the area today. Moving on down towards Chernopopivka, we also saw some Russians getting hit in this area as well. Check it out. Alright, we're going to be muting that. Cool. But we can see the Russian vehicles being blown up near Chernopopivka, and it does appear that they are, in fact, popping off. That is a joke that has gotten old very long ago, but we still continue to use it because it works with Chernopopivka. And so with that, we are now going to be moving on from that clip. Absolutely great to see they were able to effectively destroy those forces. And we're going to be bypassing the Bakhmut area, of course, the breaking news of the day, considering that we already covered that earlier. And so moving on beyond Bakhmut and down towards the direction of Orlivka, we also saw some Russians panicking about a Ukrainian drone that was flying over them and just taking a little gander at them. We can now hear the clapping begin.
Clap it out.
Oh no, блядь, Igor. It appears that I ran into a little bit of Matthew's tuberculosis, блядь. And we now see another one running for the hills. And we can see this guy running.
Look, I'm looking up with the drone. What is their plan?
I don't know what the plan is, but it's stupidity, whatever it may be. And so they see in the clip, you can see the chaos unfolding because of the drone. Panic ensues. And so with that, we're now going to be moving on entirely out of the Donetsk area, because that was the only video clip we got from there. And we're now going to be moving down towards Pavlivka, where we saw that a Ukrainian SSO unit was firing off some rockets. Check it out. Check it out. You see them firing the RPGs, and taking turns firing them, as is tradition. Oh, we can see a M4 over there. Very neat indeed. And we can now see them getting the next RPG ready. And we can, of course, see them making a queue to fire their RPG. And we see the cameraman going up and the music
they're sneaking in that copyrighted music.
Man, the music just busted my eardrums out, but that RPG is also busting up some Russian forces, and so I guess it's kind of fair. But with that, that's the end of that clip right there. Very neat to see. And we're now going to be moving on down towards the area of Staromaiorsk, where we saw some, a Ukrainian M249 gunner using his machine gun to mow the fields. And look at that. It's like a weed eater, but better and cooler.
Wow, he really is mowing.
Dude, this man, call this man John Deere, because he be mowing.
Call him Snapper.
Have you ever wanted to find yourself a badass lawnmower? Well, then you, my friend, ought to find yourself the M249 saw. Chambered in
it's a Dixie Chopper.
Dixie Chopper. I don't know if that's going to work in modern day, but nevertheless, we can see him mowing down the grass right there. We now see him getting a little bit low because he's decided to add the feature where you start chopping up the grass real good. And now that's mowing a lawn the manly way. And we can now see him running across the berm and to the other side. And we now see him getting down. And moving past what may be a wounded Ukrainian soldier laying on the ground, and he is in fact wounded. And with that, that's the end of the clip. But there was an M249 gunner mowing the grass. Very effectively, I may add. Moving on from that area and towards Volkresenka, we saw that a Buke system was destroyed in this area. Check it out! We're going to be beating that. There's the
I
Buke.
got some of that magical music in this one.
Oh, the Harry Potter music. But there's the Buke, actually, right there. And it gets hit. Don't know what this vehicle is, but the missile spazzes out. And we can see the missile still going, and we can see another one explode in its rack. And there goes the missile across the other direction of the field. With that, that's the end of the clip, but very nice to see that they were able to destroy a Buke system. Moving on from that towards Novopetrovka, we also saw some Ukrainian tanks on the move in this area as well. And we can see the tanks moving. We can see these Ukrainian soldiers resting as well as the tanks continue to advance forwards. And we see this guy taking his time filming the tanks rolling on by, because tanks are always a sight to everyone, even the soldiers. They like tanks too. Tanks are cool. And so with that, that's the end of that clip, but just a really neat one to see. We're now moving on to the next one near Robolny, where we saw the Ukrainians were able to destroy a pretty high-end Russian BMP-3. And when I say high-end, I mean this would be something high-end for the United States in the 1970s, but for the Russians, this is top-notch stuff. And look, they were even using it at a logging camp. Look at all the logs. And here goes the BMP-3, gets blown up. Very nice. We can see the shell hitting right there, knocking the hatches around, and we now see the smoke billowing out of the BMP-3, and it will most likely brew up and burn on down a little bit later on. We're now going to be moving on from the BMP-3 near Robolny being destroyed, and we're now going to be moving a little bit backwards towards Tokmak, as a large explosion echoed through the city today, apparently as the Ukrainians hit a pretty important strategic target. We can see the smoke billowing from the site in the distance. But at the moment, we unfortunately don't know what that target was. We just know that it was hit, and it was severely damaged. We're now going to be moving on from that little bit of news in Tokmak and on towards the Kherson area, as we also saw something interesting at the Novikhovka Dam. We got a view of the dam and the reservoir today from a drone. And this is quite rare, but check it out. Here's the Novikhovka reservoir, completely emptied. We're looking at Kakovka right there. Novikhovka is just off the right side of the screen. And now we're looking at Novikhovka, and we can also see the destroyed dam as well. And we can see that that was so thoroughly destroyed that it had to have been rigged with mines and blown up by Russian forces. There's really no other way to explain the absolute extensive damage that was caused, because it was completely blown away. The only thing that exists are the pump houses in the center, and that may only exist because the ground it was sitting on was too thick to be blown away by mines. But with that, we're now going to be moving on from that interesting little clip showing what the Novikhovka reservoir is looking like in the present day, and further on down towards Kazachi Lakhuri, as we saw smoke emanating from the other side of the river. We believe it's somewhere in this area, and we don't know what the smoke is coming from, but it does appear that another ammunition cache on that side of the river was hit and was possibly destroyed by Ukrainian fire today. If so, that is great to know that the Ukrainians are continuing to destroy ammunition depots, as the further destruction of those ammunition depots deprives the Russians of combat abilities. Moving on into some of our last bits of news in the Kherson area, we also saw that an electronic warfare system that the Russians had mounted on top of a building in Aleski was destroyed today as the amazing music begins to play. It's of course copyrighted and therefore muted, and we can see the drone hitting the rooftop and damaging and then destroying the electronic warfare system. We now see it just a burning mess on top of the roof, and now we can see that thing is really burning. And with that, That's seeing the clip right there. But love to see that the the electronic warfare system was destroyed by some drones. And so with that, we're now going to be moving on up to Kyiv to cover the speech from President Volodymyr Zelensky here on day 526 of the war. And so, without further ado, here is the speech. Speech!
Speech!
Бажаю здоров'я, шановні українці, українки. Було багато сьогодні нарад. Різних. Міжнародна робота, внутрішня безпека, оборона держави. Нарада щодо Кримської платформи, зміст саміту, міжнародна присутність на саміті. Його вплив на нашу можливість тиснути постійно для звільнення Криму. Ми працюємо над деталями. Причому вже готуємо не лише саміт Кримської платформи на рівні лідерів у серпні, але й парламентський вимір Кримської платформи. Цей саміт буде восени. В Закарпатській області сьогодні другий день важливої наради з послами України. Вчора, сьогодні були найвищі політичні та найвищі військові рівні спілкування. Дуже предметні розмови послів з міністром оборони, з главкомом, з командувачем повітряних сил, з віце-адміралом Нейшпапа, командувач ВМС, керівник зовнішньої розвідки Литвиненко, секретар РНБО Данілов. Всі. Я спеціально попросив і главкома Залужного, і командувачів, і з паном Кулебою, щоб вони провели відповідну нараду, щоб ключові речі, які так потрібні нашим воїнам, нашим силам оборони, щоб вони все це донесли послам. Сьогодні також на нараді був прем'єр Шмигаль, Свириденко, Юлія, Стефанішина, Кубракова. Були зустрічі послів з головою Верховної Ради України Русланом Стефанчуком щодо парламентської дипломатії, яка може бути дуже ефективною, якщо цілком відповідатиме нашій загальній державній стратегії. Важливо, щоб посли України були максимально в деталях, в матеріалі, щоб кожної потреби України – зброя, техніка, снаряди, фінанси, конкретні політичні рішення. Дякую всім, хто був активним на цій нараді. Закарпатті. Дякую, Закарпаття, тобі за такий прийом. Були сьогодні доповіді керівника Служби безпеки Малюка та міністра внутрішніх справ Клименка. Зокрема, одне з питань – перевірка воєнкомів. Поговорили ми детально. Перевірка виявляє багато зловживань, відверто огидних. Всі факти виявлені правоохоронцями. Вони представлять обов'язково суспільству та розслідують в межах кримінальних проваджень. Висновок очевидний. В системі комплектування потрібні люди, які розуміють, що таке цінність захисту України. Цінність, а не ціна рішень. У військкоматах мають працювати люди, які бачили війну, пройшли її. Є ті, хто, на жаль, втратив кінцівки, але не втратив гідність і не втратив Україну. Дякую їм. Міністр Клименко окремо і детально доповів щодо підготовки наших нацгвардійців, забезпечення боєприпасами і технікою – пріоритет. Також щодо захисту критичних об'єктів, зокрема атомних станцій, обговорили ситуацію в регіоні після російського теракту на Каховський ГЕС, забезпечення людей всім необхідним. І також міністр доповів щодо вжитих заходів для протидії злочинності. Змістовні доповіді по всьому комплексу роботи Міністерства внутрішніх справ. Звичайно, фронт, бої важкі. Окупанти всіма силами намагаються зупинити наших хлопців. Штурми дуже жорстокі, Куп'янський, Лиманський, Бахмутський, Мар'їнський, Авдіївський напрямки, південні напрямки. Всюди непросто, але що б не робив ворог, саме українська сила домінує. Я дякую за це кожному і кожній на фронті. Особливо відзначу сьогодні бійців 15-ї бригади оперативного призначення Нацгвардії, Мелітопольський напрямок. Дякую, хлопці. Також відзначу воїнів Ізмаїльського прикордонного загону, які разом з морськими підрозділами протидіють російським атакам шахедами. Загалом терористи вже запустили проти України вже щонайменше 1961 шахед, і значну частину вдалося збити. На жаль, не всі. Ми працюємо, щоб збивати більше, щоб максимум збивати. Працюємо, щоб було більше систем ППО. Зокрема, це завдання для кожного нашого посла, усіх представників, усіх представниць України. Всі повинні працювати. Всі. на перемогу, на захист життя і людей, і захист нашої прекрасної України. Ми обов'язково переможемо. Слава Україні!
And Herom Slava.
And Slava Ukraini. And with that, that is the end of the speech from President Volodymyr Zelensky here on the 526th day of the war in Ukraine. And that is the beginning of many interesting things in this live chat. The beginning of many day 526 topics that many of you all have been talking about. And the top questions of the night put to votes. This is something of a democracy, after all. Y'all do get to vote.
It is Democracy Manifest.
Wait a minute.
You see what's happening here?
Democracy Manifest. Notice the headlock here. Get your hands off my... But anyways, this is a bit of a democracy as far as it comes to the leading topics of the news tonight. And we always put up some of the major opinions that we see on some of these topics into polls, and y'all then get to vote on them, and we get to see what all of y'all are thinking about certain subjects. And it's very interesting to us. Some critics always wonder, why do polls run? And the reason why they run is because we want a massive amount of viewer engagement on the topics we talk about each and every night. And one of the best ways to do that is for y'all to personally vote on y'all's opinions on certain topics. And we make sure to give the wide range of options from completely supporting the topic to completely condemning the topic. And it's always interesting to see what people really think when it comes down to the things that have happened today and what y'all's opinions are on it. It's also something that people in the future can look back at. Decades down the road, these streams on YouTube may still exist, and people will be able to come back to each and every day of the war and look at the frontline situation and the news on this stream, and not only that, they will get a window and a glimpse into the people that lived at that time and what they thought and what the major opinions were on topics from every single day. And when you really think about that from a historical context, just the polls themselves and the service that they may be years or decades down the road, it is incredibly interesting to think about. But nevertheless, let's get into what people have been saying about some of those top-notch
polls of the night.
Top-notch topics of the night. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
All right, and our first poll says, considering the Wagner threat, should Poland begin using lethal force to protect its border? 80% said yes, the circumstances 100% justify it. 10% said, maybe, but it seems extreme. 5% said unsure, and 5% said no, cannot use lethal force freely. And on this one, I'm a little bit mixed on this, because when I say should Poland use lethal force to protect the border, that means both in the air and on the ground. So, of course, Poland does have a slight migrant issue, which we will not get into the politics of that. But of course, using lethal force, you really can't distinguish who is who. So who you think might be a Wagner soldier could actually simply just be a migrant crossing the border, and you end up shooting and killing someone over something like that. So it does have downsides to it, but at the same time, considering the circumstances, it could be warranted. But Enforcer, what say you?
I would have to say, I think that lethal force, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. Because lethal force, for one, will ensure that no Wagner infiltrators make it into Poland. But at the same time, they may also end up killing just random innocent refugees that got stuck in Belarus, and the Belarusians are forcing them onto the border to try and cross, and then they get shot, and it's really out of their general lack of decision making that they're being shot for is probably the best way to put the situation inside of Belarus. So I would say, perhaps, honestly, I'm going to have to remain undecided on that one, because it's a really hard one to make a decision on. And so with that, I hope that does address that fairly well in my opinion. And with that, we are on to the next one.
All right, and up next we have a poll that says, is there any circumstance where NATO should conduct a first strike on Wagner troops? It looks like 51% said no, NATO should never first strike. 28% said yes if Wagner says it will invade. 15% said probably not, but maybe. And 5% said unsure. And on this one, it seems to me like NATO is definitely a defensive alliance. It is not an aggressive one that goes out seeking conflict. So I would say that NATO should never first strike. Let them throw the first punch, and then we can respond to it in bold fashion. but I would not be the one starting the fight. But Enforcer, what say you?
NATO is a defensive alliance by creation, and therefore it should only respond to attacks. It should never be a preemptive organization, because then it's not a defensive pact. It is a pact of countries that are going to bully others, and that's not really what NATO is for. And so with that, I hope that does address that fairly well, and we are on to the next one.
All right. And our third poll says, reports suggest that Ukraine is preparing a massive, large-scale drone attack on Moscow, actually unprecedented in size. And what are your thoughts? The 84% said good. Moscow 100% deserves it. 7% said it's justified but unwise right now. 6% said bad, don't attack civilian targets. And 4% said unsure. And I do believe it would be justified because Russia has attacked Ukrainian cities many times in the past and very brutally. However, two wrongs don't necessarily make a right, even though it would be justified. I think it would be unwise right now, especially because that could greatly escalate the war unnecessarily. And also, like I said, two wrongs don't make a right. So, Enforcer, what say you?
I would have to say I think it is justified, especially if the drones are going to be attacking military targets like they have been so far, or strategic targets like the Ministry of Technology. I think that is completely justified given the current framework of the war. But at the same time, I would heavily dissuade. In fact, I would denounce any attacks that are made against Russian citizens, because if the Ukrainians start to attack Russian citizens, that kind of puts them on the same playing field. Of course, you could view it as vengeance, but at the same time, are we going to allow the Ukrainians to stoop down to being animals like the Russians in the guise of trying to get even with them? And that's something that I don't think should happen, because under that same premise, the United States should have been able to, let me think of a good way to compare what we did in World War II. Well, here's a good way to compare it. If this is the case where the Ukrainians can attack Russian civilians because it's getting on a level playing field and it's fair, then that means that logically, going off of that same assumption, there would be nothing wrong with the American internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War, because that was just a tit for tat with the Japanese. And I think that if we were to try and apply that logic, a lot of people would go, well, no, that's not the case. And therefore, I would say it would not be right for the Ukrainians to attack the Russian citizenry to try and get even. The whole thing about the Western world is that we are better than the Russians in that we don't attack civilians and we don't take out frustrations by killing civilians. That's kind of the whole deal. So I would say,
yeah, no civilian attacks. I have to say I'm 100% behind Ukraine, but the West is relying on Ukraine not to start getting on the same level as Russia. And of course, Ukraine has been dealing with Russia's brutality and their war crimes for many, many months. In fact, the entire time the war has been going on. I understand why Ukraine is getting frustrated, but I think Ukraine should exercise caution when they start attacking places like Moscow, because it's really hard to distinguish between a civilian and a military target right in the middle of the city. And thus far, it doesn't look like anybody's been injured by their drone attacks, but that could change, and that could jeopardize Western support.
And also, I saw someone say, we nuked entire cities in World War II, LOL, in kind of a reference to we don't attack civilians. The thing is that World War II is a little bit of a different time as far as bombing campaigns went. Nobody spared civilians because there was really no way to accurately drop the bombs at that time to avoid civilian casualties. So the decision was made by really every country in the world that instead of, precisely targeting a factory, they would just carpet bomb the city, and hopefully the factory would get hit in the carpet bombing, or whatever their actual target was, it would just get hit in the bombing. And so
was the Geneva Conventions even in force at that time?
Oh yeah, there were Geneva Conventions, but I don't believe the Geneva Conventions covered anything about precise bombing at that point by aircraft. So really everyone just went and carpet bombed cities. The Germans carpet bombed London, the British carpet bombed Berlin, the Americans ended up carpet bombing all of Germany and Japan by the end of it. And wherever the Japanese could, they would, really attack with aircraft. They didn't really have strategic bombers like any other country did, but they would attack with their aircraft without any concern whether civilians were in the way or not, because that's just the way World War II was fought. And it's also really annoying to me whenever anyone comes up with, I believe it was and I'm trying to think of the name, what the hell was it? It was the Dresden bombing or something like that, where they say that 300,000 German citizens were killed in a single day. That's incredibly inflated. I believe the number was somewhere close to around 30,000 German citizens were killed in a day, a fairly large amount, but not 300,000. And also that tries to make it sound like the Allies were evil, although the Germans had just gotten done killing 11 million people in concentration camps and had carpet bombed every major city in Britain for about 2 or 3 years. And it killed, I believe, somewhere around 200,000 Britons alone in those bombing campaigns. So, you know, that's something that I don't really get. Because they're like, oh, did you know that the Allies carpet bombed Dresden and they ended up killing people? It's like, well, yeah, that was kind of the war. That's what everyone did. So, you know, it's like making a big deal out of something that was normal at the time. But anyways, also, by the way, yeah, that's a good point. Ogd brought up a great point. Said, don't forget the Japanese balloon bombs. Now, that is something that a lot of people don't know about, and something I completely forgot about until you brought it back up. But the Japanese actually designed these bombs. They were like actual just crates of explosives that they would attach to these massive balloons, and they would just let them take off from Japan, and the jet stream would carry them over the North Pacific and right down onto the West Coast. And they were hoping that these things would let go, or they would lose altitude right over major urban areas on the Western coast and end up hitting them. Luckily, none of them ever did. They actually, a lot of them ended up making it to America, but they would end up landing in farm fields and exploding there or somewhere else. And so they ended up really not causing a lot of damage. But once again, while the Japanese didn't really have the ability to fly strategic bombers to the United States and hit America that way, they did try, nevertheless, to just indiscriminately bomb American citizens with the balloon bomb. So that is a pretty interesting note in its own right, and also Jacob Gordon's going with the usual argument or the debate that's had around the use of nuclear weapons on Japan at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is that they ended up actually saving lives, and from what we understand, they did. The 2 atomic bombs ended up killing about 180,000 Japanese. That would have been in exchange. And yeah, that's a pretty large amount. But when you hear the estimations and the predictions by the United States of what the casualties would have been in a land invasion of Japan, that pales in comparison. It was assumed that nearly 500,000 to, I believe it was something like 700,000 Americans would lose their lives in a mainland invasion of Japan, and millions of Japanese would die as the government would not give up regardless of the outcome. They would continue to fight until the very end. So it was assumed...
And also, I would add another distinction, that the situation with Ukraine attacking Moscow does not compare to that, because Ukraine's survival does not depend on them attacking Moscow with drones. That does not, make their survival, perfect. But in that instance where we dropped a bomb on Japan, that was entirely different. Like you said, that could have gotten a lot worse and cost a lot more lives.
Yeah, and that's the point I'm making exactly right there. And so with that, I hope that does address that fairly well. And with that, I think we're on to the next poll.
All right. And our next poll says the U.S. is considering placing armed troops on civilian vessels near Iran. And is this a good idea? 63% said yes, put them on the ships. 20% said, I need more info on that. 10% said no, that's too risky and provoking. And 7% said unsure. And I would say definitely put them on the ships. I see no problem with that whatsoever. In fact, I'm not sure why we haven't done it yet. If Iran wants to screw with a civilian vessel, they can also screw with our military. So we can give them the 1-2 punch all at once. But Enforcer, what say you?
I would say certainly put them on the ships, the boats, and the yachts. Put them on everything. Because I don't think the Iranians should be able to intercept cargo ships, arrest the crew, and then impound the ships. It's completely illegal. Almost every single time they do that, this ship is in international waters. And so I would say, without a doubt, put armed soldiers onto these ships so that way the Iranians can no longer seize them and try and hold their crews for ransom or diplomatic favors. And so with that, I hope that does address that fairly well in my opinion. And with that, we are on to the next one.
All right, and there is no next one. That is our last one. So we're moving on to our Super Chat questions yet again. And this one goes to Richard Ager, who puts in a $50 donation. And thank you very much, Richard, for the very generous support. He says, great work as always, folks. And thank you for keeping us all up to date. No question today, and enjoy law school. And thank you.
And thank you so much for the support, Richard, and the kind words as well. And thank you for wishing us well in law school. Hopefully, it will be good. I had to get my textbooks today, and I cried. They were very expensive. Very expensive. I've never seen books that expensive in my life going through normal college. So I was like, good God. So I thank you so much for the support, because that's certainly going to be going towards the college book fund. And thank you so much for enjoying the work we do on this channel. Folks like you who support this channel make it possible for us to keep this thing rolling. If it wasn't for folks like y'all who went out of y'all's way to support this channel and help us keep this thing running, we wouldn't have been able, and we wouldn't be able to do this as a job. And so thank you so much once again, Richard, for looking out for this channel and supporting us and helping us keep this thing running, because folks like you make it possible for us to come on air every single night and run this show. And so thank you so much once again. I hope that does address that fairly well. And with that, we are on to the next one.
All right, and up next, we have a $25 super chat from none other than BC Skyman. And thank you very much, BC, for that support. And sadly, no comment left here, but he already left for the night as well. But thank you very much, BC. And Enforcer, what say you?
And I got to thank BC Skyman so much for the support. Of course, a channel legend and an old guard. And I got to thank you so much once again, BC Skyman, for supporting this channel. You didn't throw in a comment, but the support does mean a lot and does help us to continue to make comments throughout the rest of the night. Thanks to you helping to support us and helping us to be able to run this show. And so with that, thank you so much once again for the support. I hope that does address that fairly well. And with that, we are also going to be putting that towards the book fund. And with that, we are on to the next one. And thank you so much once again.
And our next one goes to Cindy Mitchell, who puts in a $20 donation. And thank you very much, Cindy, for that support. She says, Nana and the Tuck, send it to the chat, Matt. And it's good to see you both. Hello to Tuck and hello to Nana. And we will send that to the chat in honor of that super chat. And it's going to go to Gunther, who says, Enforcer, did you see the PMC cut through the Poland gate?
No, I did not, actually. I would have to say I declare ignorance on that for a moment. I'll try and look for that off stream. But I do thank you so much once again for sponsoring that live chat, Cindy Mitchell, and of course helping this channel to keep on running, because folks like you have been around for a long time. And also, hello to Lil Tucker. I believe he is the youngest member of the Lee Spring Army. And thank you so much once again to both of y'all for watching tonight, and of course supporting this channel and helping us to keep it running. But I haven't seen anyone cut through any border gates, especially the Wagner. And so I would have to say I have not seen that, but I will be trying to look for that, and maybe we'll put that into tomorrow's war summary. And so with that, we are on to the next one.
And I think he might be getting that mixed up with another video that was out today where some migrants were on the border of Poland, and they started doing something and messing with the gate, and then they started firing some fireworks at the Polish border guards. That could be what he's referring to, but I personally haven't seen that video of the Wagner trying to get through myself.
And I would agree. I haven't seen the Wagner getting through, but I did see the one where they were firing off the fireworks. And also, another thing I just saw, someone said those books should be all available in digital copy, which costs nothing pretty much to duplicate infinitely. But the thing you're not getting is that people have to make a buck. And with these books from law school, the reason why they're incredibly expensive is because they don't sell a lot of copies of them. It's not going to be the New York Times bestseller, which every book in the world is at this point for some reason. So they heavily increase the costs, so that way the author and the publisher can actually make some money off of it. Does that make it right? No, I don't think so. And that's also why the digital copies are still incredibly expensive as well. They're only like $20 or $30 cheaper. And when you're talking about books costing $300 a pop, and in case of y'all are wondering, I had to buy $1,300 worth of books today, which was insane. I've never seen books cost that much. That's why they cost that much. Is it right? I don't know. I mean, in my opinion, not really, because I'm the one having to pay for it. But I can understand why they cost that much. It's just that it's something I'm not a big fan of paying for. But with that, I hope that does address that fairly well. And with that, we are on to the next one.
All right, and the next one goes to Marion Deemer, who puts in a $20 donation, and Marion did not leave a comment, but of course, Marion, thank you very much for always supporting the channel almost every other night, and we do appreciate it very much, and helping keep us running. And Enforcer, what say you?
And thank you so much for the support, Marion Deemer. You didn't throw in a comment, but you are an old guard and a channel legend, and that speaks for itself. And I got to thank you so much once again for always supporting this channel. You never miss a night supporting this channel, and I gotta thank you so much once again, because if it wasn't for folks like you who have always looked out for this channel and helped to support us and help us to keep this thing rolling, this wouldn't have been possible. Of course, living isn't free, and we have to always be able to pay for things like college books and also food and gas to be able to go to college. well, more so law school now, which is really weird to say. I don't even think I can ever get used to saying that. But nevertheless, support like that helps us to be able to do everything behind the scenes, so that way we can focus on this as a full-time job. And I gotta thank you so much once again, Marion, for constantly supporting this channel, because folks like you have been making this possible. And so thank you so much once again. I hope that does address that fairly well. And with that, we are on to the next one.
And also, I think it was Susie Q say, get a Black's Law dictionary. And I actually just put that in my Amazon cart as we speak, because that is actually something useful to have, and I will get one of those. And thank you for reminding me, because I should have ordered that today. And I didn't. I don't know how I missed that, but you saved me on that one, so thank you. But anyways, up next, we have a $10 super chat from Writer's Eye, who says, Root Beer Fund, live a little. Thank you. And take a live chat question, please.
And thank you so much for the support to the Root Beer Fund. I like root beer. I like IBC, and I believe it's Dad's Root Beer, if I'm correct. That's one of the brands. Those are honestly two of my favorite root beers, and we will be making sure to put that towards the Root Beer Fund, because as some of y'all may know, we don't drink. We haven't actually touched alcohol in our lives, beyond, of course, that obligatory sip that you must take when you turn 21. Beyond that, we haven't actually drank any alcohol, so the closest thing we ever get is to root beer. And so thank you so much once again for the support to the Root Beer Fund, because we will be making sure to get absolutely sloshed on root beer and also grab a live chat. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
And the live chat question goes to Chris, who says, Matt, were the Switchblade UAVs successful in Ukraine, or were they a failure?
From what we understand, they were not successful, and it appears that the original use of them led to no further requests for them, because they were underwhelming in almost every regard. And so with that, I hope that does address that live chat fairly well, and thank you so much for sponsoring that. And with that, we are on to the next one.
And the next one goes to Psyops, who puts in a $10 donation. And the first part is sketchy. Can't read it, but thank you very much, Psyops, for the support. He says, Slava Ukraine and Herom Slava. And he says, and the last part is also sketchy, but that Slava Ukraine part isn't. And Herom Slava once again. And Enforcer, what say you?
And Slava Ukraine and Herom Slava. And thank you so much for the support, Sabs. Sadly, a good amount of that had to be censored, but we know that your intentions are good. It's just that it's not PG. And so with that, thank you so much once again for helping this channel to keep on running. I hope we addressed that the best we could. And thank you, Psyops, for being here with us tonight. Because, of course, like many others, you are also an old guard and a channel legend. And so with that, we are on to the next one. And thank you so much once again for the support.
Yes, indeed. And up next, we have a $10 super chat once again from Psyops. He says, does Putin qualify for the draft? Or does his head being stuck up his ass qualify as medical exemption?
I believe he is too old for the draft, and he is also medically exempt as well for that reason. So that would be my answer. He is not eligible for the draft. And also, you have to remember that Putin is a god among men. He can't be drafted because that would be an absolute that would be a crime against the edict of heaven. Oh no, the mandate of heaven. Oh goodness. But anyways, I'm just kidding. He actually technically is not eligible for the draft because I believe he's over the age that the draft in Russia is for. But if it gets desperate enough, he would be drafting age. And so with that, I hope that addresses that fairly well. Thank you so much once again for the support and helping this channel to keep on running. And I just saw someone say in the live chat, and this is an interesting point, someone said, if you wanted to try the taste of beer, there's alcohol-free beer. And then someone said, honestly, why bother drinking alcohol-free beer? And that's kind of my thing. You know, it's like, if you drink decaffeinated coffee, what's the point of drinking coffee? Because, you know, you drink coffee for the caffeine. If you take the caffeine out of it, there really is no point, in my opinion, to drink coffee. You know, and that's kind of the logic I apply to everything. You know, it's like, why drink beer if it has no alcohol in it? You drink beer for the alcohol. So it would only make sense to drink a normal beer that has alcohol in it. That's that prohibition kind of alcohol, Matthew, the one that's alcohol-free.
Uh-huh.
But anyways, with that, I hope we addressed that side note fairly well. It's a little bit of a rabbit hole, kind of a nice one. And someone said, it all tastes horrible. I think it kind of does. I think I've actually gotten used to drinking horrible stuff, though, because I drink nitro cold brew every single night, just straight up without any milk or sugar in it, and it is reprehensibly terrible. You can never even get used to the flavor of that. It is just bad. But anyways, with that, I hope that addresses that fairly well, and we are on to the next one.
All right, and the next one goes to Walter A. Lakota Jr., who puts in a $20 donation. And thank you very much, Walter, for that support. He said, Aloha, the Enforcer Matt, and LSA from OG Ellison Bosun. And anything about merchant ships, ask me, because I'm one in real life. A book you should try and get or read is Merchantman, or Man of War, a book about merchant ships.
And thank you so much for the support, Walter. And also, thank you for joining us tonight from the OG Ellison Bosun. I actually let Matthew get it out that time without trying to do it at the same time. But I got to thank you so much once again for the support and helping this channel to keep on rolling. And also, you are our merchantman guy. You are a merchant marine. And so, if you know anything about cargo ships, merchant ships, it would be you. And so I have a question for you, Walter, and you can answer this in the live chat, and we'll circle back to it when the answer is given. But are you a big fan of armed soldiers being aboard merchant ships? For example, a marine detachment or a naval rifle squad being aboard the ship. That's something that would interest me. And also, if I'm correct, naval rifle squads, I believe, are obsolete at this point. I don't even think they really use them. I think the last time they were actually a part of naval doctrine was in the 1960s or 70s. But did you know that, Matthew, that for a long time, naval rifle squads were a thing where they would just take sailors off of the ship, give them some guns, and then just let them sail to shore, and it was like small little detachments of just sailors from the ship and not Marines?
That's crazy, man. Those guys were, ready to bust a cap on someone.
Let me see if I can pull one up. The Navy rifle squads. Man, damn, you sound like you got tuberculosis. But let's see here. Let me see if I can find a good picture. There's a good thumbnail on YouTube about it. But where the hell are the good pictures? Come on. Oh, come on. Don't tell me they don't have any good pictures of this stuff. Because it's a thing, it's a full-on thing. You know what? I'll just show the thumbnail because from, let's see, who's it from? It's from Battle Order, I believe, because this is probably the best. But yeah, they're just sailors that are given guns, and they just get on the away boats, they go to shore, and they land. A destroyer could field like 2 platoons of these naval rifle squads, and it was like the first lieutenant that went with them. And it clicked, Matthew, why there were away teams on Star Trek. Is because Star Trek was trying to imitate the naval rifle squads, and that's why you always had the red shirts, because those were the naval rifle squads for Star Trek.
Oh, man, that's pretty slick.
Yeah, that's pretty slick, and you wouldn't know that unless you knew these were a thing. But nevertheless, a really interesting little side note, but I hope, and also, let's see, Matt, I'm a fan of naval armed forces on a merchant ship, from Suez Canal to the Persian Gulf. So Walter is a big fan of putting armed forces, like a Marine detachment, onto merchant ships that are passing through that area. And pretty interesting to hear. I would largely agree with that. It wouldn't make sense, considering that the Iranians are openly hostile to merchant traffic in that area, to just leave them unarmed and undefended. So I think that is certainly something that should be done, is that these ships should have armed crews on board, or armed rifle detachments on board. And so with that, I hope that does address that fairly well, and thank you so much once again for the support, Walter. I hope that does address that fairly well. And thank you so much once again for being an old guard of this channel. You have been around for a very long time, and there's long times when you're not on because you're away at sea. And we're always, every once in a while, talking about you when you're away at sea. We're like, man, where's Walter at? Where's he at? And then you finally show up one day, and then you stay around for like a week or two, and then you're away at sea again. But I got to thank you so much once again, Walter, for being here with us tonight and supporting this channel, and also allowing us to talk about some interesting stuff revolving around merchant ships, naval rifle squads, and putting armed soldiers on board ships that are passing through the Strait of Hormuz or similar areas. And so with that, thank you so much once again for support. I hope that does address that fairly well. And with that, we are on to the next one.
All right, and the next one goes to Rider's Eye, who puts in a $10 donation. It says, book cover fund, thank resell. Harvard or Princeton? Ha! Harvard or Princeton. That's funny.
Oh, man. Oh, man. If only you knew. We're going to the worst law school in Alabama. I'm just kidding. But still, thank you so much once again for the book cover fund. $10 will provide the book cover. It won't provide the pages that we need, but it will provide the book cover nevertheless. And I got to thank you so much once again for the support, Rider's Eye. And you're absolutely right. Book covers help out greatly with resale. If you don't have a book cover, just forget it. Just throw the book away. It's pointless. Useless. You can't even resell it. Just absolutely worthless. But thank you so much once again, Rider's Eye, for supporting this channel and helping us to keep this thing running, because folks like you make this channel possible. And if it wasn't for folks like you, we wouldn't be able to keep this thing running. And so with that, thank you so much once again. I hope that does address that fairly well. And with that, we are on to the next one.
And up next, we have two $5 donations. The first is from James Moon, and we have one from CK Bold as well. And they both want us to grab a live chat question. And we will grab two in honor of those two super chats. And the first one goes to Private Public 77, who says, should we support Russian anti-Putin and anti-war draft dodgers?
Well, here's the thing. And this is something I always say. Diplomacy and geopolitics isn't fair. While I don't think that it's a smart idea for people to dodge the draft, and that's actually true, you should always encourage your enemy to do what's not in their best interests. And that would be draft dodging. And so I would say, yeah, sure, I think that the Russians should dodge the draft. If they were smart, they would know that's not good for them. But nevertheless, we don't really care about letting them know about that. We want to win. And so we want to dissuade draft dodgers on our end, because it's also their duty to defend their nation, but at the same time we also want to encourage our enemy to draft dodge. And that's also why I believe that a large push on draft dodging is foreign subversion in some ways, especially from some groups. Some of y'all may know about the International Peace Corps, or the IBC, or the IPC, that started to exist around the late 1950s, 60s, and then on into the 70s in large form. And it sounded like an organization with amazing goals and aims, but interestingly enough, they were critically anti-Western, and critically anti-American, and just always lambasted the United States for everything. And then one day, Hungary tried to rise up in 1956 against the Warsaw Pact and tried to break out of the communist fold. And then the Soviets came in and they crushed the Hungarian uprising and killed hundreds. And for some reason, the International Peace Corps didn't really say anything about it. They actually kind of supported what the Soviets were doing, although at the exact same page, they would condemn the United States for doing something similar in Guatemala. And then it was found out that there was a little interesting paper trail where the International Peace Corps was getting a good amount of its funding from the Soviet Union, and then it started to lose a lot of credibility in the public eye. And then later on in the 1960s and 70s, they would also go on to encourage draft dodging in the United States. And that kind of shows that, you know, with the historically proven paper trail that they had where the Soviet Union was funding them, and therefore it was largely a mouthpiece for the Soviet Union outside of their borders, it kind of shows that draft dodging is encouraged by other foreign powers that wish to see the United States and other Western nations become weaker. They want you to think that weakness is a smart thing and something that should be encouraged. And so that's also why there's a decent amount of a push. And people go, look, see, the Chinese and the Russians, they back up draft dodging. No, they don't back up draft dodging for themselves. They back up draft dodging for you because that allows them to screw you over a little extra. So with that, I hope that does address that fairly well. And with that, we are on to the next one. But thank you so much once again for support and helping this channel to keep on rolling.
Yes, indeed. And up next, we have an $8 super chat from Sully Canuck, who says, apparently there were more Canadians who volunteered and fought in Vietnam with the USA than there were American draft dodgers who came to Canada.
And thank you for the support, Sully Canuck. And not to go into the huge details on that, but funnily enough, that actually is true. Canadians will actually come across the border and volunteer in the U.S. Army to go fight in Vietnam more so than Americans left the United States to go to Canada, which is a very weird, interesting fact about the Vietnam War, because the Canadians seemed more apt to fight the war than some Americans were. So, you know, and it wasn't even their conflict, which was the weird part. But with that, I hope that does address that fairly well. And thank you so much once again for throwing out the interesting little tidbit there. And thank you once again for supporting this channel and helping us to keep this thing running. And with that, we are on to the next one.
And the next one goes to Mike Jones, who puts in a 5 and says, may the Russians feel as restless as Ukrainians.
And thank you for the support, and hopefully the Russian public will, but I don't think that should be achieved by attacking the civilians and citizens directly. I believe that should just be done by attacking military strategic targets near to them and putting that thought in their head, but never actually following through on it. You see, I'm not an opponent against psychologically torturing the Russians by making them think that they may be a target, but I'm completely against actually making them the target, because then that enters a whole other realm. You know, it's kind of like the best way for me to explain my logic there, it's like threatening someone to do something, but never actually going through with it because you know it's wrong. You know, you can put the thought in their head that you may go through with it, like, you know, for example, the United States threatening to nuke someone, but never actually going through with it because the implications of actually nuking someone is a pretty severe thing. And so with that, thank you so much once again for support. I hope that does address that fairly well. And with that, we are on to the next one.
And real quick, we forgot to get that second live chat question earlier, so this one goes to Jillian, who says, did y'all hear that 2 Chinese-American sailors gave China our military secrets and pictures of our equipment? And I heard
did.
about that too. Obviously, you got to have due process, but if they did that, that's real crappy. I was about to say something else, but that's real crappy.
That's treason, is what it is, and I did hear about it. Apparently, they did it for some cash, like a few $1,000s, which is the stupidest thing, because I'm starting to hear about a lot of massive security breaches for, like, piddly amounts of money. And it's like, I would kind of get it if it was, like, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars that they were being offered for this stuff, but they're being offered, like, $10,000, and then they give away national secrets, which is just stupid, but... Yes, I did hear about that. We didn't cover that on the news because this is, of course, largely Ukraine war news. But I was very aggravated to hear that once again, some of the sailors in the U.S. Navy, but this is not the first time, put their own interests above the interests of the nation and national security. And so with that, I hope that does address that fairly well. And thank you so much once again for sponsoring that live chat. And with that, we are on to the next one.
And the next one goes to Sickled, who puts in a 20 and says, retainer for future legal problems, and if you got a loose spring, you got a lawyer. I'm telling you, a $20 retainer. I'm telling you, the rates are getting low these days.
Man, we're giving out retainers like people are giving out haircuts these days. But still,
yes, but seriously though, thank you for the support.
And thank you so much, Sickled, for the support. And thank you for putting that towards the retainer fund for future legal problems. If you've got a leaf spring, you've got a lawyer. And I got to thank you so much once again for support, Sickled, and helping this channel to keep on running. There's folks like you make this channel possible. And you make it possible for us to keep this thing rolling, to keep this thing running just like we are right now. And so thank you so much once again. You are, in fact, the sickest lid out there. And I thank you so much once again for helping this channel to keep on running. And so thank you so much once again for the support. And we are on to the next one.
All right, and our next one goes to Russ Rizzo, who puts in a 5 and says, what do you think about double military spending, starting with salaries and benefits, and might not need a draft?
Double military spending. If we did that, I think military spending would take up the entirety of our discretionary spending.
Yeah, so it would go to like 1.8 trillion at that point.
Yeah, it would be a lot. So, and of course, yesterday, everyone knows what we talked about then. But yeah, I can't spend like that. That's too much spending. So I would say, nah, I don't think we should. And also, this is a little bit of a hot take. Especially considering how the military has changed so much in the past 80 years. But historically, the military was never really supposed to be a career. It was supposed to be something that kind of just came to be during times of war. That's why drafts were a thing, is because the U.S. Army in peacetime would only be like tens of thousands of guys. And only in the 1930s did it ever really surpass that size, and it got up to like 200,000 people before the outbreak of the Second World War. And that's why we had drafts, is because if a war broke out, we usually didn't have an army to fight it with. And so we had to get more people, and therefore we had to force people to get in the military because there was really no other way to raise the manpower at that time. That's kind of changed, and that also is maybe a reason why people may not see the necessity of drafts anymore, is because the size of our standing army is over 1 million strong, which would have been unbelievable at any other time in history. But I would say, and let me make sure I'm getting this right, because I think I've, gone on there and down that rabbit hole a bit where I kind of forgot the main prompt. But, Matthew, can you reread that prompt again just to make sure I keep on track?
They said, what do you think about double military spending, starting with salaries and benefits, and might not need a draft?
Oh, and there we go. The reason why I don't think that pay and things like that should be massively increased in the military is because it creates a social class. And the military is a thing, and obviously it's separate from the citizenry almost at this point. It's almost like a worship coveted thing. But when you increase pay massively, the military doesn't just become a thing that serves the nation. It now becomes a social class with actual spending power, and that spending power may lead them to be able to do things like lobby or change things or start to look out for the interests of the military far more than the citizenry itself. And that's kind of why military pay as a premise throughout history has kind of been kept to where people say the pay is grubby. It's kind of supposed to be that way. So that way, you know, the average rank and file soldier or a large amount of them can't just group together with their money and start creating lobbies and all sorts of crazy stuff like that, or make it a social class where people in the country, instead of fighting to be a part of the normal civilian sector where you're really supposed to be, they're all fighting to join the army because the pay is so great. So with that, I hope that does address that fairly well, in my opinion. And to be quite honest with y'all, I'm not really, you know, and of course the modern world's completely different with how wars are fought. We have to have a massive standing military at any given moment. But going through all of history and everything before World War II, if things were like that back then, I wouldn't be a massive proponent of a large standing army. Armies are militaries are there just to fight wars, and once a war is over, there's really no need for a massive military. And the United States followed that metric or that rule all the way up until the end of World War II. Starting off at the First World War, there were only 50,000 people in the U.S. Army. Only 50,000 across the entire country. And before that, hell, it got even smaller than that. After the Civil War, the U.S. Army went down to being only around 20 to 30,000 strong, all the way from about the 1860s up until about the 1890s. So, you know, it's something, honestly, that I think if we weren't in the modern world situation, I wouldn't be a massive proponent of a large standing army. I'd be much more of a proponent of people getting to work in their own stores or going to work in factories or something similar to make themselves a good living, not really have to worry about the martial side of life. But with that...
Now, to me, I would say I don't personally see any problem with people making a career out of the military, because without people making careers out of it, we wouldn't have higher ranking enlisted guys, and we wouldn't have higher ranking officers either. And you have to be in the military for, you know, over 10 years and 15 to 20 years to get to those ranks. So I don't see anything wrong with it personally. I think it's a pretty honorable career path.
I think it is an honorable career path, but I don't think, you know, historically it was one that needed to exist. And I don't really think, you know, especially if we didn't need constant readiness like we need now, I don't really think it's something that really has to exist from a social standpoint, also increasing like spending massively, because then we do run into a problem of a military industrial complex, because right now you can kind of make an argument that that's there. Increasing their spending to like 1.8 trillion, there's no doubt about it. There's plenty of money to be made in that sphere, and people are going to be making a killing in the military. And I'm not saying that, you know, folks serving in the military don't deserve to make good money, but I'm also saying if you give a general a annual salary of like $1.2 million, I have a feeling that that's going to be a recipe for things that may not be that good. They may start to spend that money to lobby Congress members to start voting for certain things that then benefit the military in themselves, you know, and then that enters the whole
They may not
sphere.
get $1.2 million, but they do get access to those private jets and all kinds of other benefits too, which, you know, it costs a lot more than $1.2 million to run that stuff. So they're getting to take their own, you know, perks of the job. But they also get paid pretty good too. They get paid pretty decent. You're not going to get rich in the military, but you know, you can make some money.
It's an honest living and it's a good thing to do. But with that, I hope that does address that fairly well. And with that, we are on to the next one.
All right, and up next we have a $10 super chat from George A. once again, who says you absolutely gave the right comment on my Polish-Ukrainian recidivist hypothetical. Your comment is what separates the Ukrainians and Poles from Russian imperialists.
And thank you so much for the support. And I didn't know I was being tested there, but I believe that the borders in Europe should remain the way they are, and we shouldn't really try and fiddle with them too much. Because that only leads to instability. I mean, hell, look at all the fiddling that was done in other parts of the world. And look at all the problems that it sometimes causes. So I think we honestly should just keep the borders the way they are, enforce Ukraine's 1991 borders, and just leave it at that. So thank you so much for appreciating my inputs on that. And with that, we are on to the next one.
All right, and the next one goes to Devin Harris, who puts in a 5 and says, "It's crazy. Russia ran for the hills after mobilization."
And thank you so much once again for the support. And they did run for the hills after the mobilization. And for the Russians, I say good on them. Make sure to do it. Run to Kazakhstan, run to Finland, run anywhere. Just get out of the country. But as far as Ukrainians go, do not encourage them to do that, because then that's how you start losing a war, like the Russians are, because all of their able-bodied manpower fled. And so with that, I hope that does address that fairly well. Thank you so much once again for the support. And with that, we are on to the next one.
And the next one goes to Russ Rizzo, who puts in a 5 and says, "Oh, I'm telling you, why don't you stream your classes or do a weekly summary? Oh, man, I'm telling you. Why don't you call me sometime when you have no class? Oh man, oh."
I don't know what the ad lib was.
The voices.
But thank you so much for the support, Russ. And to answer that question, doing live streams of a class, I have a feeling that the college would have a big problem with that because I would be paying like $1,300 for that class, and they would, hey, you can't film this class. They gotta pay money for this. And also another thing is that I have a feeling that the professors probably wouldn't want to be recorded for some reason, one or the other. But still, that is an interesting idea, though, and I will look into that. And so with that, thank you so much once again for support and helping this channel to keep on running. And with that, we are on to the next one.
All right, and with that being said, we're moving on to our live chat questions. And up first, we have the Morse code of the stream. It's Cliff Simonson, Mark Hodges, Earl Bernew, and Paul Schultz. And he said tonight's Morse code cipher says, Russia is not ready for what NATO or even Poland can do against them, and long live the LSA.
And that's the sound of money. And you all got that right on the nail. Right dead on the nail. That's the Morse code message, and I don't think they're ready for what we're going to be bringing if they keep on coming. You know what I mean?
Oh, man, I'm telling you.
Oh, man, I'm telling you. But with that...
Oh, man,
I'm telling you. I went to the border the other day, and the Belarussian said, hey, I'm going to cross. And I said, oh, no, you're not. Oh, man, I'm telling you. I get no respect around here. But anyways, with that, we are on to the next one. But thank you for getting that Morse code message correct on the 526th day of the war.
Indeed. And up next, we have a question from Gabriel Mum, who says, is there any European-produced vessel in particular that you think countries should send but have not done so yet?
European-produced vessels?
Vessels?
Vessels? Where are the nuclear vessels? But I would say, no, I don't actually think we should send them vessels because there's really no way for them to make it to the Ukrainians in the war. We would have to kind of like harbor them in Turkey and then wait for the war to end and then send it to them, and by that point they're useless. So I would say we shouldn't really care about sending them ships. We should focus on sending them aircraft and also land power for the most part. And so with that, I hope that does address that fairly well. We are on to the next one.
All right. And I saw someone say you should talk to the judge in that Rodney voice when you're a lawyer. Oh, man, I'm telling you. Hold me in contempt right now. I'm telling you. Put me in the jail. Put me in the jail. Oh, man, I'm telling you. It's rough in here. No AC. Oh, man, what's this guy doing? What you in for, pal? Oh, murder. Oh, goodness, that's his favorite.
Oh, man, I'm telling you. I was in the shower the other day. I bent over and, oh, buddy, I'm telling you. I get no respect around here. Oh, man. I had to pick up the soap. Oh, man, and I'm telling you.
Oh, whoopsie.
Oh, man, they came down on me. Oh, man, I'm telling you, it was terrible. It was terrible frightening. Oh, man, very bad. I had to get in the corner. I had to defend myself with the soap bar. Oh, man, I'm about to turn into the other guy. What happened? America can be described in one word. But anyways.
What, Jack? What?
Don't push up, fatty. But anyways, with that, we are on to the next.
All right, and up next we have a question from Andrew, who says, why can't the Belarusian volunteers fighting for Ukraine do a Prigozhin Plus, but in Belarus, for example, march to Minsk and unseat Lukashenko?
It's a great question. Why don't they? Why haven't they done it yet? They need to do it. They need to get on it. To be honest with you, I couldn't answer that question because it's something that they could certainly do, but they haven't done. Maybe they're just holding back. Maybe they're built different. Who knows? But with that, I hope that does address that fairly well. And we are on to the next one.
All right, and the next one goes to Jorge M. Rivera, who says, do you watch the Lend-Lease warehouse inside the mines of Soledar? Oh, my.
Oh, my. And no, I have not.
Man, that really changed like the whole like character of the question, adding that oh, my to it.
Oh, my. But I haven't.
What's going on in that warehouse? Oh, my.
Oh my, what's going on in that warehouse? Oh my. But anyways, moving on from that. To answer that question, I have not seen those Lend-Lease mines, or I've seen the salt mines. You know, I can show you pictures of that. It's pretty cool, actually. Take a look. It's like these giant open pits of salt. I have a feeling that you get dried out in this place pretty quickly, considering the whole thing's made of salt. There's even hotel rooms down here. I'll see if I can find you one.
Well, man, I'm telling you, that wasn't supposed to be a Rodney impression, by the way. But all the workers in this mine, they all have attitude problems. Like, I'm just being completely honest, they're all salty.
They're also salty. You know, it's like, I'm telling you, man.
You played right into that one perfectly. That
Yeah.
was seamless, I'm telling you.
Oh, man, I'm telling you. Someone needs to give us a pat on the back. Oh, man, I'm telling you. Let me brag on myself. Oh, man, we make jokes better than anyone else. Oh, man. Oh, man, I'm telling you. We can make a joke better than anyone. Oh, man. And everyone gets laughing. And then we have someone in the live chat go, hey, your jokes suck. And then we ban them. Oh, man, I'm telling you. I get no respect around here. Oh, man, if only people gave us a little bit of respect for the jokes we make. Do you know how tired we are sometimes when we're in these streets? Oh, man, we're tired. Very tired. We got out of the salt mines. Oh, man. Tough work, very tough. Oh, man, I'm telling you. No one can even top it. But anyways, getting off of that monologue, I hope we addressed that fairly well, but I've never seen any Lend-Lease equipment being in those mines. But I did see the Chechnya using them at some point, and the Wagner also used them, and then they got bombed by the Ukrainians and closed in, and we never know if they got out or not. But with that, I hope that does address that fairly well, and we are on to the next one.
All right, and we have 3 questions remaining, and the next one goes to Pakatang, who says, if the U.S. was somehow able to neutralize Russia's nuclear threat, should the U.S. invade and take over Russia when they are weakened and less able to protect themselves?
I believe that we shouldn't. I'm not really one for offensive wars, and that would be an offensive one. Of course, you know, the Russians are trying to provoke us, but if we like, what they're doing right now is that they're really like running their mouth. But if we punch first, that's how it's going to be viewed. It's going to be viewed that we started the fight, not them. I believe we should wait for them to actually do something that forces our hand and then neutralize their nuclear weapons, if possible, and then invade the country. And not really, you know, and this is going to be a little weird. We can't really overthrow the government completely. We could get rid of Putin, we could get rid of a lot of the top guys and hold them accountable, but a lot of the government structure that exists in Russia would kind of have to exist as is. You would just have to put leaders in charge that are very benevolent and very liberal in their policies compared to the Russian leaders that are in charge right now, and then kind of let Russian society do its thing and then change the government. Because if you look at, for example, us completely dismantling the Iraqi government, that ended up being a complete disaster because there was no actual government structure to keep any semblance of order or any kind of actual government institution running for several years, and that ended up being disastrous because everything fell apart, and that's also why ISIS came around. Everything like that was really because of the poor policies and handling of the invasion of Iraq in its very first years of 2003 and 2004. If we had handled it properly and we had only lightly dismantled the government and then rebuilt it with some benevolent leaders and then allowed it to change itself over time, that would have actually gone far better. We probably would have seen an Iraq like we see today, but we wouldn't have had to go through the whole ISIS ordeal and then, you know, all the IEDs and the Iraqi people hating the United States because we were going from door to door doing no-knock raids through the night, through every neighborhood, which made a lot of them hate us. And then they had unlimited access to weapons because no one was stopping them from going to the armories because the army didn't exist anymore and all that stuff. But anyways, with that, I hope that addresses that fairly well, and I hope that gives my take on what we should do in that kind of situation. But with that, we are on to the next one.
All right, and the next question goes to Drunky Monkey, who says, I keep hearing about bouncing Bettys in use by Russia and thoughts.
I haven't actually heard about that. Bouncing Bettys were a really special kind of anti-personnel mine made by the Germans in the Second World War, but I don't really know if the Russians have a modern-day equivalent to that. I think most of theirs are just contact explosives where if you step on it, they blow up. I don't really think they do a lot of bouncing them in the air, but maybe a few of them do, and I don't know about those. So with that, I hope that addresses that fairly well, and we are on to the next one.
All right, and this is our last one of the night, so unfortunately, go through the whole spiel.
And we are on to the final question of the night. And so, who is the lucky last person to throw in the lucky last question of the night?
All right, and that viewer is Dale Alaticus, who says, do you think Putin wants to escalate with NATO and the evil West to save face with his own people?
I think Russia wants to escalate with the wicked ways of the West. And I think they actually are trying. I don't really know if they want to go all the way on that, but they're certainly making moves that make it look like that. So I would say I'm leaning more so towards yes, just based off of their actions and their activities with the West at this point. It does look like they're conducting escalatory action, so it may be entirely possible they are wanting to get into a conflict with the West and then justify it, although they were the ones escalating it the entire time. So with that, I hope that answers your question, Dale. And also, that's a name I haven't heard in a while, Dale Alaticus. I, for some reason, think I've seen you every single night in the first 10-minute countdown. I've always said, hey, but I haven't heard one of your questions come up in a while, and so I hope I was able to answer that one fairly well. I hope that was what you were looking for. And with that, it is the end of tonight's stream. I thank every single one of y'all so much once again for watching tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure running the stream for y'all. And at the peak, there were 7,000 of y'all online tonight, a massive amount. And I'm completely honored to know that so many of y'all have come on tonight to watch tonight's news. If y'all did enjoy, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe on this channel and also on the stream, because it helps the stream to reach further, and it also makes us really happy when people subscribe. It brings a smile to our face, and it makes our eyes light up, because we love to know that people actually appreciate what we do and find it worthwhile to subscribe. And also, to let y'all know why y'all should subscribe. What happened? We run almost 7 days a week war summaries that are around 10 to 15 minutes long, explaining what's been going on in the war in Ukraine. And we also run these live streams 6 days a week at 10 p.m. Eastern Time every single night, covering the past 24 hours of the war. Of course, I can't guarantee that that schedule is going to continue on forever, considering that law school is starting very soon, and we do not know how busy or how difficult that's really going to be, and if we can even fit these in as much as we do right now. We'll have to figure that out, but for now, we are running these 6 days a week at 10 p.m. Eastern Time every single night. And so, with that, good night, good luck, stay safe, take care, Slava Ukraini, and long live the Least Spring Army. The Least Spring Army never dies.
And good night, LSA, Slava Ukraine, and see you all tomorrow. Yeehaw!
Yes.
The Leaf Spring Army sends its regards.
Русский военный корабль. Предлагаю сложить оружие и сдаться. Русский военный корабль, иди нахуй.